There is a moment in every violent sport when the sound disappears. It is not the roar of a crowd, or the rhythm of marching bands, or the commentary from broadcasters that stays with me. It is the sudden and absolute quiet that follows the collision. I have heard it in stadiums that hold 70,000 people, and I have heard it in cramped boxing venues where the smell of canvas and sweat hangs in the corners like a warning. It is the same silence in both places. It is the stillness that settles over the body and the mind after an impact that changes everything. It is the moment when an athlete wonders if they will rise again. I remember the first time I noticed that silence. A running back lowered his shoulder into a defender who never saw him coming. The crowd reacted, but for the two men on the field, the world narrowed to that single collision. The running back bounced up. The defender did not. Medical staff rushed toward him, and the noise of the stadium seemed to drift somewhere far outside the walls. I watched the defender blink, confused, as if he had stepped out of time. Something inside him had shifted. It was not visible to the spectators who were eager for the next play. Yet, I could sense it. The final season had arrived early for a man who did not know it yet. That moment has followed me through every story I have witnessed in this world of controlled violence. People often imagine brutality through the lens of entertainment. They remember the great fights. They recall the legendary knockouts. They replay the slow-motion shots of receivers stretched across the middle of the field. They rarely think about the second after the collision when the athlete wonders if something inside them has been permanently altered. There was a boxer I once spoke with who described the moment his life changed. He absorbed an uppercut that lifted him entirely off the ground. When he fell, he did not feel the canvas. He said it felt like falling through water. He rose to his feet out of instinct, but he later admitted that he did not remember anything after the punch. His corner stopped the fight, although he argued fiercely, as if someone had stolen something from him. An hour later, sitting alone in a dim hallway, he understood that he had entered his final season. Not the last he would ever fight, but the last in which he resembled the man he used to be. The quiet moment after that punch became the beginning of the end. The idea of a final season is rarely recognized when it begins. It does not arrive with fireworks or ceremonies. It arrives with a moment of silence that only the athlete hears. Sometimes it comes from a blow to the head. Sometimes it comes from an injury that looks minor but refuses to heal. Sometimes it comes from fear that takes root without warning. For many athletes, the final season is not a year at all. It is a single moment when the body or the mind crosses a line that cannot be crossed again. I have seen football players who ran through defenders with unstoppable force suddenly hesitate before contact. I have seen fighters with reputations for fearlessness begin to retreat for the first time in their careers. In those moments, the silence returns. It is the same silence that lingers after the first time an athlete wonders if the cost is worth it. It is not dramatic or theatrical. It is quiet and internal. It is the sound of a life changing. Football and boxing appear to exist in different worlds. One thrives on spectacle inside massive stadiums. The other thrives on intimacy inside a squared circle. One surrounds the athlete with teammates. The other strips the athlete down to a single struggle, yet the human cost is nearly identical. In both places, the body is pushed into collisions that the human form was never designed to manage repeatedly. In both places, the mind absorbs trauma long before anyone recognizes it. In both places, families watch their loved ones walk into arenas with the same mix of pride and dread. I think about the fighter who once told me that his greatest fear was not losing a match. His greatest fear was not recognizing his own children one day. He said it calmly, almost in a whisper, as if the quiet truth scared him more than any opponent. I think about the veteran football lineman who told me that some mornings he wondered if his hands would listen to his brain. He would stare at a cup of coffee, willing his fingers to close around it. He said the silence inside that moment frightened him more than any hit he had ever taken. The public sees the violence. They see the hits. They see the punches. They celebrate the physical dominance, the strength, the courage, the defiance of pain. They rarely see the small tremors that appear years later. They rarely see the sleepless nights, or the forgotten conversations, or the moments when the world seems to tilt out of place. They rarely see the silence that becomes part of the athlete's life long after the cheers end. I often ask myself why we celebrate brutality, why we reward collisions that break bodies, why we applaud punches that shake brains, why we find beauty in moments that leave athletes changed forever. I have watched men devote their lives to these sports. I have seen their passion and their discipline and their unwavering belief that greatness requires sacrifice. I have also seen the price. I have watched former champions struggle to remember the movements that once came naturally to them. I have watched football players walk with slow, careful steps as if their legs were learning to function again. I have watched once fierce warriors stare into the distance with an expression that tells me they are fighting a battle that no one else can see. The silence binds these two sports together. It is the moment when the human cost becomes real. It is the moment when the athlete recognizes that this life demands everything. It is the moment when the world's celebration feels distant, as if it belongs to another life entirely. There is a beauty in these sports, but it is a beauty built on risk. There is courage, but it is courage forged in the presence of danger. There is triumph, but triumph that carries a weight few people understand. Football and boxing are not shaped by the victories. They are shaped by the toll that victory demands. They are shaped by the quiet moments when an athlete tries to understand what they have given and what they have lost. Every brutal sport has its own truth. In football, the impact arrives fast and unexpected. In boxing, the impact arrives from an opponent who stares you directly in the eyes. Yet the aftermath is the same. There is always a moment when the athlete wonders if they will be the same again. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. That uncertainty is the heart of brutality. The silence after the impact is the most honest sound in sports. It tells the truth even when no one else wants to hear it. It reveals the cost even when the world celebrates the spectacle. It lingers in the mind long after the highlight reels fade. It reminds the athlete that there is always a price for choosing a life built on collisions and punches. It reminds the rest of us that the entertainment we love is shaped by human beings who live with consequences far beyond the final whistle or the final bell. This documentary begins in that silence. It begins in the moment after the hit and after the punch. It begins in the stillness where the truth waits. It begins in the space where the final season often begins without warning. It begins with the question that every athlete eventually faces. How much can the human body and mind endure, and why do we ask them to endure so much? Brutality is a word people use casually in sports conversations, yet few truly understand what it means when the lights fade and the body begins to reveal the cost. When I speak about brutality, I am not talking about cheap theatrics or exaggerated toughness. I am speaking about the cultural, biological, and psychological weight that shapes a life lived inside violent competition. It is the force that separates these sports from every other form of entertainment. It is the acceptance of risk that becomes part of the athlete's identity. It is the understanding that every contest might leave a lasting mark that no camera will ever capture. The early decades of boxing were raw, unregulated, and openly dangerous. Fighters stepped into the ring with a simple understanding that the outcome would be decided not only by skill, but by the willingness to absorb punishment. As the sport evolved, it became cleaner in structure, but never softer in spirit. Public fascination grew precisely because the danger was undeniable. the ring offered no place to hide. The audience witnessed every shot, every stumble, every moment when a fighter's pride overcame pain. Boxing carried an honesty that few sports could match. The violence was direct. The consequences were immediate. Anyone watching felt the weight of each punch, even if they could not feel the pain themselves. The sport rewarded speed and force. The athletes grew bigger. The hits grew harder. The stakes rose. The field became a landscape where bodies were trained to generate impacts that defied the limits of human anatomy. What began as a test of grit and tactical mastery became one of the most physically punishing sports in modern history. Stadiums expanded. Broadcasts elevated the scale of the spectacle. Highlight reels glorified the most violent moments. Fans cheered as if the hits existed without consequence. Football became a national force because it offered something primal. It offered the sight of bodies crashing together with irresistible momentum. It offered danger disguised as entertainment. Science eventually revealed the truth that had always been hiding in plain sight. In boxing, the danger was obvious because the trauma was concentrated on the head and face. In football, the danger was scattered across the body, but most devastating inside the brain. Concussion research exposed the fragility of an organ that cannot heal the way muscles can. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, once a term known only to specialists, became a public warning about the unseen cost of repeated impacts. Scientists discovered that even hits that did not produce symptoms could create microscopic damage that accumulated over time. Former players described headaches that never fully went away, memory lapses that emerged too early in life, and mood shifts that frightened their families. Boxing had always been linked to cognitive decline, but football introduced a new layer of complexity. The head trauma was not the result of a single blow. It was the result of countless collisions, each one too minor to notice until the accumulation became impossible to ignore. I once heard a neurologist explain it in simple, stark terms. He said that the brain does not care whether the force comes from a punch or a tackle. It responds the same way. It swells, it strains, it changes. A former fighter told me that every punch carried a piece of his future with it. A retired football player told me that he felt the consequences of his career in the pauses between thoughts, as if his mind were learning to move through mud. Those testimonies carried no bitterness. They carried recognition. They carried the understanding that they had chosen lives built on danger, and that the danger had followed them into retirement. The public perception of brutality in these two sports has always been uneven. In boxing, the violence is impossible to deny. A fighter enters the ring with the clear intention of striking his opponent until the contest ends. Fans expect to see punches that leave marks. They accept the visible danger because it is part of the sport's identity. No one pretends otherwise. Football is different. People celebrate the athleticism, the strategy, and the team unity. They see the violence as a component rather than the foundation. They watch collisions with excitement without recognizing the full weight of the impact. The sport has presented itself as a balance of skill and power. But beneath that presentation lies a truth that mirrors boxing more closely than most fans realize. Retired fighters often talk about the ring as a lonely place. They speak about the moment when the bell rings and there is no one to rely on except themselves. Retired football players speak about the field as a place where unity creates safety, yet the impacts do not soften because of camaraderie. A former linebacker once told me that the most dangerous hits were the ones neither player expected. A former welterweight champion told me that the most dangerous punches were the ones he never saw coming. Both spoke about unpredictability as the true source of fear. Both described the brain as the ultimate record keeper of every mistake. As I prepare to guide you through the next chapters of this story, I recognize that brutality in sports is not a single idea. It is a layered experience shaped by identity, money, culture, science, fear, ambition, and legacy. Over the next 20 sections, we will explore the forces that created these violent worlds and the forces that keep them alive. We will look at the origins of violence and the culture of toughness that teaches athletes to ignore pain. We will examine the science of impact and the silent injuries that accumulate year after year. We will step into the final seasons of athletes who began to feel their bodies fade and the struggles that unfold when the arena no longer defines them. We will close with a legacy that brutality carves into the lives of those who lived through it and the way future generations will interpret these sacrifices. This journey is not about glorification. It is not about reverence for pain. It is about truth. It is about understanding the cost of sports that ask human beings to collide with the world at full force. It is the story of human beings who choose challenging lives, driven by passion, hope, desperation, ambition, or the simple need to prove something to themselves. It is the story of a culture that admires strength and often overlooks vulnerability. It is the story of a world that demands spectacle and rarely accepts responsibility for what the spectacle leaves behind. We begin now with the first chapter, where violence itself took root long before either sport existed in its modern form. I have spent a lifetime watching athletes collide with a kind of force that strips away the polite illusions we wrap around modern entertainment. When I trace the origins of that collision, when I step back far enough to see sports not as polished leagues, but as echoes of something older and more primal, I find myself returning to a truth that is both uncomfortable and undeniable. Human beings have always been drawn to violence. We have always tried to master it, ritualize it, celebrate it, and survive it. Football and boxing are not outliers. They are two branches from the same ancient root, a root shaped by instinct, survival, and the eternal need to prove who stands on top. Long before the stadiums, before the gloves, before the helmets and rulebooks, there was the simple fact that early humans competed for resources and status. Strength meant protection. Power meant food. Dominance meant safety. When two men fought, the victor was not simply the stronger one. He was the one the tribe trusted. He was the one who could lead. That instinct never truly disappeared. It hid beneath the layers of civilization and then resurfaced in the games we created to test the boundaries of our bodies and our courage. Boxing rose first because it required almost nothing to exist. Two hands, a circle, a group of witnesses. In every ancient society, you can find some version of the fight. Sometimes it was ritualized combat. Sometimes it was punishment. Sometimes it was entertainment. The common thread was that people watched because brutal competition reflected their own fears and desires. There was something magnetic about watching two individuals push themselves to the brink. It allowed the audience to confront danger from a safe distance. It reminded them that survival was still a skill measured in real consequences. Football emerged much later, born from a mix of rugby, military drills, and a cultural appetite for structured aggression. America shaped it into something distinct, something faster, larger, louder, and more theatrical. Yet, at its core, it carried the same instinctive appeal as the oldest fights. It allowed society to channel immense physical force into a controlled environment. The hits were not random, they were strategic. The violence had purpose, meaning, and hierarchy. And the reward for enduring that punishment was heroism. Fans celebrated the men who stood in the center of that storm. They admired the courage it took to survive the chaos of the line of scrimmage. They applauded the runners who broke through walls of moving bodies. They praised the men who sacrificed themselves for the ball, the team, and the moment. As these sports evolved, the audience's relationship with brutality changed. In the beginning, people watched because the violence mirrored life itself. Over time, they watched because the violence became spectacle. They understood that the risk separated ordinary people from extraordinary ones. The athletes on the field and in the ring were performing something most people could not imagine doing. Every punch absorbed, every collision endured, every moment in which the body buckled but the person kept going. It created a kind of myth around the athlete, an idea that they existed in a different physical world, a world where fear could be swallowed and pain could be ignored. Boxing sharpened that myth to a razor edge. It stripped competition down to a single confrontation. One opponent, one body against another. When a fighter stepped into the ring, he carried the weight of every instinctual memory humans had ever held. The need to stand tall. The need to prove worth through physical contest. The need to demonstrate resilience in the face of threat. For centuries, the ring became a place where society measured toughness. Boxers were admired not simply for winning, but for enduring. A fighter who absorbed punishment and kept moving forward became a symbol of unbreakable will. The crowd found something deeply compelling in that refusal to surrender. They connected to the bare humanity of it all. Football took a different path. Its brutality became layered beneath strategy and complexity. The game masked violence with structure. It allowed fans to talk about schemes, speed, and athleticism without acknowledging the underlying truth that the sport was built on controlled collisions. Early versions of football were so violent that deaths were common. College teams lost players every year. The public demanded reforms. Rules were introduced to prevent fatalities. Protective equipment evolved. Yet, even as the sport tried to distance itself from its deadlier origins, the violence remained at the center of its identity. Fans celebrated big hits. Coaches admired toughness. Players were shaped by a culture that instructed them to push through pain, ignore fear, and treat injury as part of the job. Both sports show how brutality became entertainment not through coercion, but through a shared hunger for the rawest expressions of human ability. People watched because they saw in these athletes a distilled version of themselves. Not the version that attends meetings or scrolls through screens. The version that once had to hunt, fight, and survive. The version that knew danger intimately. It is not that society loves violence for its own sake. It is that violence, when controlled and ritualized, reveals a test of character that few other things can match. I remember speaking with older fighters who described their first experiences in the ring not as moments of fear, but as moments of clarity. They talked about the silence before the first punch landed. They talked about the way instinct sharpened their senses. They talked about how the fight felt like a return to something ancient. A place where everything was simple. You either controlled the moment or the moment controlled you. When I spoke with former football players, especially those who played in the trenches, they described a similar feeling. They talked about the point of contact when two bodies collided. They talked about the surge of power, the momentary blackout, the sudden return of sound. They talked about how the violence of the game created a bond, a shared understanding among teammates that only those who lived inside those collisions could truly grasp. Over time, society learned to package that brutality. Promoters marketed it. Teams branded it. Television amplified it. Highlight reels made it look heroic. Fans came to expect it as part of the entertainment. Yet, despite all the cameras and commentary, despite the rules and the governing bodies, the foundation of both sports never changed. They are still tests of dominance. They are still reflections of instinctive human behavior. And they still demand a level of courage that exposes the deeper cost of pushing the body beyond its limits. The origins of violence in sports are not found in the arenas or the leagues. They are found in the human condition. When people cheer for a knockout or a goal line stand, they are not celebrating the injury. They are celebrating the confrontation with danger. They are celebrating the human capacity to face fear, absorb pain, and continue moving forward. That is why boxing and football continue to thrive. They connect us to something ancient, something we rarely admit but always feel. The desire to witness strength tested in the harshest possible way. This is why brutality became entertainment. Not because people enjoy suffering, but because people recognize the courage required to confront it. The origins of that attraction reach back through centuries of history and into the earliest parts of who we are. And when I watch athletes step into the ring or onto the field, I am reminded that the line between survival and sport is thinner than we want to believe. Football and boxing are not outliers. They are two branches from the same ancient root. Boxing rose first because it required almost nothing to exist. Two hands, a circle, a group of witnesses. In every ancient society, you can find some version of the fight. Sometimes it was ritualized combat. Sometimes it was punishment. Sometimes it was entertainment. When a fighter stepped into the ring, he carried the weight of every instinctual memory humans had ever held. The need to stand tall. The need to prove worth through physical contest. The need to demonstrate resilience in the face of threat. For centuries, the ring became a place where society measured toughness. Boxers were admired not simply for winning, but for enduring. A fighter who absorbed punishment and kept moving forward became a symbol of unbreakable will. The crowd found something deeply compelling in that refusal to surrender. They connected to the bare humanity of it all. Football took a different path. Its brutality became layered beneath strategy and complexity. The game masked violence with structure. It allowed fans to talk about schemes, speed, and athleticism without acknowledging the underlying truth that the sport was built on controlled collisions. Early versions of football were so violent that deaths were common. College teams lost players every year. The public demanded reforms. Rules were introduced to prevent fatalities. Protective equipment evolved. They talked about the way instinct sharpened their senses. They talked about how the fight felt like a return to something ancient. A place where everything was simple. You either controlled the moment or the moment controlled you. When I spoke with former football players, especially those who played in the trenches, they described a similar feeling. They talked about the point of contact when two bodies collided. Boxing rose first because it required almost nothing to exist. 2 hands, a circle, a group of witnesses. In every ancient society, you can find some version of the fight. Sometimes it was ritualized combat. Sometimes it was punishment. Sometimes it was entertainment. The common thread was that people watched because brutal competition reflected their own fears and desires. There was something magnetic about watching 2 individuals push themselves to the brink. It allowed the audience to confront danger from a safe distance. It reminded them that survival was still a skill measured in real consequences. Football emerged much later, born from a mix of rugby, military drills, and a cultural appetite for structured aggression. America shaped it into something distinct, something faster, larger, louder, and more theatrical. Yet at its core, it carried the same instinctive appeal as the oldest fights. It allowed society to channel immense physical force into a controlled environment. The hits were not random, they were strategic. The violence had purpose, meaning, and hierarchy. And the reward for enduring that punishment was heroism. Fans celebrated the men who stood in the center of that storm. They admired the courage it took to survive the chaos of the line of scrimmage. Every moment in which the body buckled, but the person kept going. It created a kind of myth around the athlete, an idea that they existed in a different physical world. One body against another. When a fighter stepped into the ring, he carried the weight of every instinctual memory humans had ever held. The need to stand tall. The need to prove worth through physical contest. The need to demonstrate resilience in the face of threat. For centuries, the ring became a place where society measured toughness. Boxers were admired not simply for winning, but for enduring. A fighter who absorbed punishment and kept moving forward became a symbol of unbreakable will. The crowd found something deeply compelling in that refusal to surrender. They connected to the bare humanity of it all. Football took a different path. Its brutality became layered beneath strategy and complexity. The game masked violence with structure. It allowed fans to talk about schemes, speed, and athleticism without acknowledging the underlying truth that the sport was built on controlled collisions. Early versions of football were so violent that deaths were common. College teams lost players every year. The public demanded reforms. Not the version that attends meetings or scrolls through screens. The version that once had to hunt, fight, and survive. The version that knew danger intimately. It is not that society loves violence for its own sake. It is that violence, when controlled and ritualized, reveals a test of character that few other things can match. They talked about the surge of power, the momentary blackout, the sudden return of sound. They talked about how the violence of the game created a bond, a shared understanding among teammates that only those who lived inside those collisions could truly grasp. And they still demand a level of courage that exposes the deeper cost of pushing the body beyond its limits. When people cheer for a knockout or a goal line stand, they are not celebrating the injury. They are celebrating the confrontation with danger. They are celebrating the human capacity to face fear, absorb pain, and continue moving forward. That is why boxing and football continue to thrive. I have spent countless hours listening to former athletes describe injuries they never admitted existed. The concussions they brushed off, the subconcussive hits they called minor, the lingering fog they convinced themselves was normal. Inside the locker room and the gym, there is a language of denial. There is a pact of silence. Players do not speak of the headaches that refuse to go away. They do not reveal the memory lapses that make them second-guess themselves. They do not share the emotional volatility that arrives unannounced, leaving them exhausted and bewildered. And yet, these silent injuries are as real as any broken bone or torn ligament. They are the injuries you cannot see. The injuries that creep in over time. The injuries that redefine a career and a life in subtle, devastating ways. Boxing has long been associated with visible trauma. Swollen eyes, split lips, a nose permanently reshaped. These marks are proof of courage, proof of commitment, proof of the price paid for every victory. But beneath the surface, hidden injuries accumulate in a far more dangerous form. The repeated jarring of the brain, the rapid acceleration and deceleration within the skull. The punches that land just below awareness all create microscopic damage. Axons stretch and tear. Neurons fire erratically. Chemical imbalances occur. Over years, these minor injuries develop into patterns of cognitive and emotional decline that often do not become evident until retirement, when the applause fades and the isolation begins. Fighters describe a creeping unease, a sense that their mind is no longer entirely their own, that thoughts slip like water through fingers. They call it fatigue, distraction, forgetfulness. But the truth is far deeper. The trauma lives inside them silently, reshaping their identity. Football produces a parallel story, but it is masked differently. A running back runs full speed into a defensive wall. A linebacker meets a block head-on. The collision is not always catastrophic, and often it is over in seconds. Fans cheer, coaches nod, players dust themselves off. Yet each impact reverberates inside the brain. Subconcussive hits occur every play, almost imperceptibly, but their effect accumulates. Players describe moments of disorientation they learned to ignore. They forget plays, miscalculate distances, or feel a sudden irritability without explanation. The injuries are not sudden and dramatic. They are silent and persistent, accumulating across seasons and careers. These invisible wounds often go unrecognized by the athletes themselves because they are trained from the start to ignore discomfort and to mask vulnerability as a sign of strength. I have listened to players describe the fear of admitting weakness. They know that showing hesitation can cost them playing time, respect, or even a contract. They fear the stigma. They fear the judgment of teammates, coaches, and fans. So they downplay headaches, they hide dizziness, they ignore emotional changes. One retired player told me that he continued to play through symptoms because he worried the team would consider him expendable. Another former boxer described convincing himself that the blackouts after sparring were normal, rationalizing the dizziness as fatigue. These stories are not exceptional. They are endemic. They illustrate a culture in which acknowledgement of injury is a risk in itself. Silence becomes survival. Denial becomes a shield. Yet denial cannot erase damage. Years of repeated concussions and subconcussive hits create a condition now widely known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. This disease has been observed in countless retired athletes from both football and boxing. Symptoms are insidious and varied. Memory loss, impaired judgment, depression, aggression, emotional instability. In the early stages, these symptoms may appear as subtle lapses. In later stages, they can completely dominate a life, severing connections to family, career, and personal identity. For those who live inside the disease, every day is a negotiation with a body and a brain that have been shaped by repetitive trauma. They feel the weight of the sport long after it has released them from its direct control. I have spoken to doctors who described cases that haunted them. Patients who were vibrant in their 20s and 30s, and then, over the course of a decade or more, began to show cognitive and emotional changes they could not otherwise explain. They described former athletes who were once disciplined and reliable, now erratic, forgetful, and prone to mood swings. These changes are the direct result of silent injuries. And yet the athletes rarely see it coming. The symptoms are subtle. They are gradual. So they are easy to attribute to stress, aging, or ordinary life. But science has made it clear that repeated trauma is the underlying cause. It is cumulative, insidious, and irreversible in many cases. One of the most difficult realities to accept is that these injuries are often invisible to everyone else. Friends and family see the outward appearance of health and strength. Fans see the body on the field or in the ring and perceive resilience. Coaches see performance metrics and judge toughness. But beneath that exterior, the brain may be changing in ways that cannot be measured with a glance or a statistic. Former athletes have described the alien sensation of realizing their mind no longer works in the ways it used to. Tasks that were once second nature require effort. Conversations become confusing. Emotions erupt unexpectedly. These are not failures of character. They are the lingering effects of an environment built around repeated, normalized trauma. Denial and fear play a key role in perpetuating this silence. Internalize the idea that admitting to injury is a weakness. They fear replacement, criticism, and the end of opportunity. They hide symptoms from teammates, trainers, and medical staff. Sometimes they even hide them from themselves, rationalizing dizziness as fatigue, irritability as stress, or forgetfulness as busyness. The combination of self-denial and cultural pressure allows injuries to accumulate quietly, unchecked. By the time recognition occurs, it is often too late to reverse the damage. Boxers and football players share this experience, though it manifests differently. In boxing, the danger is immediate and isolated. The knockouts, the concussions, the moments of visible trauma are intense but rare. The subconcussive damage comes from sparring, from the thousands smaller impacts that never produce a blackout but gradually weaken the brain. In football, the hits are frequent and repeated. They occur on every play. They are often unnoticed by the players themselves. The rhythm of the game disguises the accumulation, making the quiet brain injury even harder to detect. Yet the outcomes converge. Memory decline, emotional instability, and early cognitive impairment appear in both sports with a frightening consistency. The underlying mechanisms differ in technique, but align in consequence. I have listened to players speak with a mix of reverence and regret about their careers. They do not resent the sport. They do not regret the victories. They mourn the moments they could have preserved if the injuries had been understood or managed differently. They talk about the knowledge that, had they known the long-term risks, they might have approached their careers differently. But knowledge does not erase experience. These injuries are a permanent footprint. They mark the athletes in ways no highlight reel, trophy, or statistic can reveal. The silent injuries exist at the intersection of courage and cost. They demonstrate the price of toughness, of performance, of competition. They reveal that every game, every round, every collision carries consequences beyond what is immediately visible. They remind us that the body can endure only so much, and the mind even less. And they illuminate the human capacity to carry fear and denial simultaneously. To live with the weight of what cannot be seen, and to continue pursuing excellence even when the consequences are hidden. These silent injuries are not myths. They are a science-backed reality. They are a human experience repeated across generations of athletes. They are the echo of every punch absorbed, every tackle endured, every decision to play through pain. And they are the bridge that connects the spectacle of the sport to the long-term truth of its cost. I have spent years asking athletes why they endure the unthinkable, why they step into a ring knowing a single punch could alter the course of their life, why they run into a wall of linebackers with every ounce of their body and every piece of their pride, knowing that the consequences may linger long after the applause fades. The answers are never simple. They rarely involve glory alone. Most of the time, they involve money, opportunity, and a desire to escape circumstances that offer no other path. There is a quiet, unspoken understanding that in these sports, the risks are immense. The rewards are tangible, and the opportunity to rise out of obscurity is often fleeting. And so athletes choose violence not for the thrill alone, but for survival, ambition, and the rare chance to claim power in a world that has offered them few alternatives. Boxers, in particular, know that each fight carries stakes beyond the ring. The purse at the end of the night is not just compensation. It is a lifeline. It is the opportunity to provide for family, to pay debts, to invest in a future that otherwise might not exist. Many fighters I have spoken to come from neighborhoods where opportunity is scarce, where schools underperform, where crime and poverty shape daily existence. Boxing offers a way out. It is a path that rewards courage and discipline in a society that often offers neither. But that path demands a body that is willing to endure repeated trauma. It demands nights spent sparring until knuckles are raw and eyes are bruised. It demands an understanding that pain and reward are intertwined, and the choices are stark. For many, walking away from that opportunity is not a realistic option. Football offers similar pressures, though the dynamics differ slightly. Players know that each season is a gamble. Careers are short, often lasting less than a decade. Injuries are common. Contracts are conditional. But within those contracts lies access to wealth, stability, and social status. For many athletes from disadvantaged backgrounds, football represents more than sport. It is the promise of education through scholarships. It is the chance to lift their family out of poverty. It is the possibility of security in a world that has offered little. And yet, the sport is violent by design. Every practice, every snap, every tackle is a calculated risk. Players understand that the price of opportunity is pain, that the pursuit of power requires sacrifice. I have talked to athletes who describe the calculus of these choices in stark terms. One former boxer told me that he would often enter the ring imagining that every punch absorbed was $1 earned. He said it helped him compartmentalize the danger. It was not just pain, it was currency. A linebacker from a major college program described a similar mental strategy. He said that each tackle was an investment in his future. He was willing to absorb every hit because he understood that the career he wanted depended on his willingness to endure. These moments of reflection reveal a complex truth. Athletes are not reckless. They are rational in their own framework, negotiating risk against reward with a precision few outsiders can comprehend. Yet that framework comes with a cost. The body pays the immediate toll. Bruises, fractures, concussions, torn ligaments. The mind pays as well. Stress, anxiety, and the quiet fear of long-term consequences become companions. Even the most disciplined athletes cannot escape the knowledge that their health may be irreversibly compromised. And still they push forward. Because to stop is to surrender the opportunity they have fought so hard to achieve. To step away is to relinquish the chance to escape a world that has offered them little. And in that surrender, there is often no safety net, no alternate path, no guarantee of security. The calculus of violence is not simple. It is fraught, unavoidable, and deeply human. I remember a conversation with a retired NFL player who described the weight of these decisions with painful clarity. He spoke of the time he returned to the field after an injury because he feared losing his roster spot. He spoke of the sleepless nights when he wondered if the sacrifices were worth it. He spoke of watching younger players make similar choices and feeling both pride and terror for them. Money, power, and opportunity are potent motivators, but they come with strings attached. Every decision to stay in the game, every refusal to rest or recover fully, carries consequences that extend far beyond the field or the ring. The culture of these sports reinforces the drive toward sacrifice. Teams, managers, promoters, and coaches reward endurance. They celebrate players who return from injury, who push through pain, who perform at the highest level despite physical and mental strain. Athletes internalize these expectations, often believing that to step back would be to fail. The drive toward performance becomes inseparable from the pursuit of livelihood. Financial incentive is no longer simply an external motivator. It becomes part of the identity, a defining measure of worth. And when combined with the cultural pressure to maintain toughness, it produces an environment where sacrifice is not just expected, it is demanded. Boxing, with its solitary nature, amplifies these dynamics. A fighter does not share the responsibility with teammates. Every injury, every miscalculation, every setback is their own. The financial pressure is absolute. The decisions to continue despite pain are intensely personal. I spoke with a former champion who described fighting with a fractured hand in the final rounds of a title bout. He said he could not afford to withdraw. The purse, the sponsorships, the reputation all depended on him finishing the fight. He bore the physical and psychological consequences alone. These stories are not anomalies. They are reminders of the transactional nature of risk and reward in a sport that combines violence and livelihood in a single, unrelenting package. Football players, while sharing responsibility with a team, face a similar equation. Every snap, every tackle, every block contributes to career longevity or termination. Injuries are unavoidable, yet the contract, the draft, and the potential for endorsement create pressures that push players beyond the threshold most would consider safe. Young athletes learn quickly that financial opportunity is finite. Each year in the league is precious. Each game is a window into a career that could vanish with a single misstep. The incentive to endure, to perform, to sacrifice becomes overwhelming. The choice is rarely about desire alone. It is about survival within the economic and social realities of professional sport. I have also spoken to athletes who wrestle with guilt. They understand the cost of the game. They see teammates and opponents who suffer consequences that extend far beyond the applause. They know that in their pursuit of opportunity, they participate in a system that exacts a heavy toll. But the financial reality is inescapable. They weigh the invisible costs against the tangible benefits and often conclude that the risk is necessary. The decision is not taken lightly. It is calculated. And yet, the human body and mind are imperfect calculators. The future is never guaranteed. There is an inherent tension in this reality. On one side is ambition, hope, and the pursuit of better circumstances. On the other side is physical degradation, cognitive risk, and emotional strain. Athletes make these decisions consciously, but the culture surrounding them nudges them relentlessly toward endurance. Money, power, and opportunity become the justification for extraordinary risk. Sacrifice is romanticized, normalized, and expected. Athletes internalize these values because the alternative, refusing the sacrifice, is often not an option. The consequences of opting out can be immediate and life-altering. Ultimately, the stories of athletes in boxing and football are stories of human courage entwined with economic and social forces. They illustrate the lengths to which people will go when opportunity is scarce and stakes are high. They reveal how a culture that venerates toughness and performance can intersect with financial and social pressure to produce extraordinary acts of endurance. They remind us that the glory we celebrate comes at a cost invisible to most observers. And they underscore a truth that runs through every career, every fight, every season. The pursuit of money, power, and opportunity often demands sacrifices that leave a permanent mark on the human body and spirit. I have spent years listening to men define themselves through sport. Men who step onto the gridiron or into the ring are not simply athletes. They are embodiment of an ideal that stretches far beyond performance. They carry the weight of a cultural blueprint, one that tells them who they must be and how they must endure. In boxing and football, the notion of masculinity is intertwined with toughness, endurance, and emotional restraint. It is defined by the willingness to absorb pain, to continue when the body protests, to hide fear and doubt beneath a facade of stoicism. And in the quiet corners of locker rooms and gyms, that ideal shapes the identity of men in ways that are profound, invisible, and often dangerous. From the earliest moments in training, athletes are taught to measure themselves against a standard of unflinching courage. In football, that standard manifests in the way a player confronts injury. A linebacker who stands after a crushing tackle without complaint is praised. A quarterback who ignores lingering pain is celebrated. Coaches, teammates, and the culture of the sport reward the suppression of vulnerability. In boxing, the ideal is even more immediate. A fighter who wobbles or hesitates is seen as weak. The ring is a stage where fear must be invisible, where pain must be endured without acknowledgement, where any lapse can have immediate consequences. The lessons are simple, but relentless. Toughness equals worth. Endurance equals respect. Showing emotion equals weakness. I have spoken with athletes who describe the internalization of this code as both a source of pride and a burden. One former football player told me that his identity was inseparable from his ability to ignore injury. If he felt pain or fear, he was not failing the team. He was failing himself. A former boxer described a similar process. He said that for years he trained his mind to recognize fear but never acknowledge it. He learned to move through terror as if it did not exist. That suppression became part of his self-definition. He became the person who could endure anything, who would never step back, who would never admit vulnerability. Yet the cost was profound. The harder he worked to suppress emotion, the more it surfaced in unexpected and sometimes destructive ways. Masculinity in these sports is performative and absolute. Athletes learn that their value is not measured solely by statistics or victories. It is measured by their willingness to embody an ideal. That ideal demands self-sacrifice, relentless perseverance, and the refusal to show weakness. It becomes a form of identity so pervasive that it extends beyond the playing field. Many athletes carry it into their personal lives, expecting themselves to endure hardships, to mask vulnerability, and to present a controlled exterior no matter what turmoil they face internally. The cultural reinforcement is unrelenting. Coaches, fans, and the athletes themselves reward endurance, reward stoicism, reward suppression. Yet there are consequences to this form of identity. Emotional suppression carries risks as tangible as physical injury. Athletes I have interviewed describe difficulty expressing feelings after their careers ended. Relationships strained under the weight of unspoken frustration, fear, and grief. Some struggle with anger or depression that had no outlet during their playing days. Others describe a kind of emotional flatness, a persistent numbness that both shields and isolates them. The lessons they internalized endure, suppress, perform have value on the field and in the ring, but can become liabilities off it. Masculinity, as defined by the culture of violence, is not inherently harmful, but when combined with repression and expectation, it can be profoundly destructive. In boxing, the consequences are intensified by isolation. Fighters spend hours alone in the gym or the ring, training under the eyes of coaches but ultimately facing pain alone. That solitude reinforces a particular model of masculinity. You must be self-sufficient, stoic, resilient, and enduring. Emotional expression is discouraged because it signals weakness. Fighters learn to compartmentalize. They name their fear but never show it. They experience pain but never admit it. And the repetition of this mindset hardens identity in ways that can last long after the gloves are hung up. Football imposes a similar identity through group dynamics. The locker room is a crucible where toughness is constantly measured. Players observe each other, communicate expectations, and model behavior. They learn to internalize pain because the group reinforces the value of endurance. Social cohesion depends on conformity to the ideal. A teammate who shows emotion or hesitates under pressure is perceived as a liability. The implicit lesson is clear. Your identity as a man, as an athlete, as part of this collective, depends on your ability to absorb, endure, and suppress. The reinforcement is subtle but relentless, shaping thought and behavior at every level of development. I have seen firsthand the tension between identity and vulnerability. Athletes often recognize, at some level, the cost of emotional suppression. They see former teammates struggle with relationships, with mental health, with post-career adjustment. They sense the long-term consequences of a culture that prizes endurance over expression. Yet the internalized ideal is so deeply rooted that stepping outside, it feels like betrayal. To admit fear is to admit weakness. To acknowledge pain is to compromise identity. To challenge the standard of toughness is to challenge the very definition of what they have been taught a man should be. The culture of masculinity in boxing and football also intersects with public perception. Fans, media, and commentators reinforce the ideal by praising toughness and valorizing endurance. Athletes internalize the applause and the criticism as markers of their worth. Injuries, fatigue, and emotional struggle are private burdens. Performance is public. The contrast creates a double bind. The athlete must succeed in the arena while managing the hidden tolls of identity and expectation. Emotional suppression is not a choice alone. It is a necessity shaped by reward, recognition, and survival. The consequences extend beyond the individual. Families report difficulty connecting with former athletes who have internalized decades of suppression. Marriages suffer, friendships strain. Former players describe moments of isolation in which they realize that the code that shaped their professional life does not fit the world outside the sport. Emotional literacy becomes a challenge because the lessons that guided success now limit adaptability. Athletes emerge into civilian life carrying the weight of identity that was forged in violence, endurance, and expectation. And yet there is another side to this identity. Many athletes derive profound meaning from the standard of masculinity they adopt. They find purpose in endurance. They feel pride in their capacity to withstand pain. They experience a deep sense of belonging within the culture that recognizes toughness as essential. The same traits that lead to emotional suppression also create resilience, discipline, and a capacity for focus that few other experiences can cultivate. Identity and masculinity in these sports are a paradox, simultaneously empowering and constraining, protective and damaging, celebrated and costly. I have come to understand that identity in boxing and football is forged in extremes. It is shaped by the necessity to endure pain, by the expectation to perform under pressure, and by the cultural reinforcement of emotional restraint. It is a construction that guides behavior, mediates risk, and defines self-worth. And like all constructions, it leaves marks that persist long after the arena, the ring, or the field is left behind. These marks are psychological as well as physical, shaping how men perceive themselves and the world around them. The pursuit of toughness becomes inseparable from the pursuit of identity. And the consequences are profound, lasting, and often invisible. I remember the first time I truly understood the power of television in shaping sports. It was not just the ability to broadcast a game, it was the way the camera transformed ordinary violence into spectacle, ordinary endurance into legend. Boxing matches became primetime theater, where every punch, every dodge, every wobble of a fighter was captured for millions of eyes. Football, too, evolved in the glare of the broadcast, its collisions magnified by slow-motion replays and sideline commentary. Suddenly, the private pain of athletes became public property. The hits that once existed in fleeting moments on the field or in the ring were now immortalized in homes across the country. The cost of brutality was no longer merely physical. It was cultural, amplified by the lens of television. Fame changed the calculus of risk for athletes. In boxing, a title fight broadcast nationwide carried more than the promise of a purse. It offered recognition, respect, and legacy. Fighters understood that their bodies were instruments of entertainment, that each fight was not only a contest of skill, but a narrative for the audience. Every punch landed was a story told in real time. The more brutal the contest, the more captivating the spectacle. Fame demanded visibility, and visibility demanded engagement with violence. Fighters found themselves balancing personal safety with the public's appetite for spectacle. The fame they sought became inseparable from the danger they endured. Football experienced a similar transformation. With television, collisions were no longer confined to the stadium. Every tackle, every sack, every dramatic play was broadcast into living rooms. Fans could witness the impact at a distance, analyzing and debating with the authority of hindsight. Players were aware that every hit could be replayed, dissected, celebrated, or criticized. The pressure to perform increased. The need to sustain image and reputation intensified. Fame, once an abstract reward for success, became a tangible expectation that shaped behavior. Athletes learned to embrace risk as a necessary cost of visibility. They carried the dual burden of physical danger and public scrutiny, understanding that the two were intertwined. I spoke with a retired boxer who reflected on the paradox of fame. He told me that the audience's adoration gave him purpose, but also trapped him in a cycle of self-expectation. Every fight was an opportunity to prove himself, not only to the judges, but to the millions watching. The applause became addictive. The approval of strangers validated his identity and his sacrifices, but it also created a pressure cooker. Every setback, every misstep, every moment of weakness risked tarnishing the carefully constructed narrative of strength. Fame became both shield and trap. It protected ego while magnifying vulnerability. It celebrated courage while magnifying consequence. In football, the stakes were equally complex. Athletes understood that the broadcast amplified both glory and accountability. Injuries were public, errors were dissected, triumphs were immortalized. Television created heroes and villains simultaneously. Players became symbols rather than individuals. The body on the field was no longer private. In boxing, a fighter who failed to perform in the glare of national broadcast questioned his own courage. In football, a quarterback who faltered under scrutiny felt the weight of expectation not just from the coach or team, but from an audience of millions. Fame reframed violence as a necessary condition of legitimacy. It was no longer sufficient to endure. The endurance had to be witnessed. In boxing, the public could not see hesitation, and so hesitation became intolerable. Fighters learned to push through pain not only for victory, but for validation. In football, the spectacle of injury became part of the narrative. Players internalized the message that showing weakness could undermine reputation. Pain was no longer simply physical. It was moral, social, and symbolic. Every injury carried with it a question: am I still worthy in the eyes of those watching? Fame also amplified risk in ways that were structural. Promoters, coaches, and leagues recognized that audiences were drawn to dramatic violence. Ratings translated to revenue. Athletes became central actors in a system that rewarded intensity and brutality. In boxing, this meant high-stakes matchups scheduled for prime time, where the promise of action outweighed concerns for cumulative injury. In football, television contracts shaped scheduling, influencing recovery times, preseason intensity, and player rotation. The structural incentives aligned with spectacle, encouraging athletes to endure, to perform, and to sacrifice health for fame and revenue. I have spoken with sports historians who emphasize the long-term consequences of this evolution. They note that television created a culture in which endurance is celebrated and vulnerability is suppressed. Athletes internalize these expectations, sometimes at great personal cost. The sport becomes not only a measure of skill, but a stage for proving identity. Visibility and recognition create a feedback loop that rewards performance under duress, encourages risk-taking, and perpetuates the very injuries that threaten careers. Fame, in this sense, is inseparable from danger. It is a driver of achievement and a source of hidden harm. The psychological dimensions of fame are equally compelling. Athletes describe the duality of exhilaration and dread. The roar of the crowd, the national broadcast, the social media attention, all create euphoria. But the anticipation of scrutiny, the fear of criticism, the knowledge that every misstep is amplified, generates stress that can be as taxing as any physical collision. Many athletes told me that they began to measure risk not by personal safety alone, but by public perception. In some cases, the need to protect image outweighed the instinct to protect the body. In others, it intensified the willingness to endure pain, to mask fear, to absorb impacts that would otherwise signal withdrawal. Fame does not replace fear, transforms it. I also learned that fame can distort memory and perception of the sport itself. Athletes recall moments differently after exposure to public narratives. Boxing highlights, football replays, commentarial shape, recollection. Painful experiences may be framed as heroic. Injuries may be remembered as mere obstacles overcome. The lens of fame alters personal history, creating a narrative that values courage and spectacle over consequence. Athletes learn to internalize this narrative, constructing identity around the story told to the public, sometimes at odds with the private reality of their bodies and minds. And yet, for all the peril and distortion, fame remains intoxicating. It provides purpose, recognition, and meaning. It offers a sense of immortality in a world otherwise fleeting and uncertain. Athletes speak of the pride they feel when the nation witnesses their triumphs, when their resilience is celebrated, when their careers are validated on a grand scale. Television amplified brutality? Yes, but it also amplified significance. It turned violence into narrative, endurance into legend, and sacrifice into cultural memory. In the end, the rise of fame in boxing and football created a paradox. It protected athletes in the form of recognition, status, and financial reward. It trapped them by magnifying expectations, increasing scrutiny, and intensifying the necessity to endure. The body was no longer private. Every injury, every struggle, every triumph became part of a story told in real time. The spectacle transformed the athlete into both hero and instrument, both admired and exposed. Fame was a gift and a burden, a lens that illuminated glory and shadows alike. I have watched athletes transform their bodies into instruments of violence. The process is deliberate, relentless, and often brutal in itself. From the first day in a boxing gym to the earliest practices on a football field, athletes are conditioned to understand that strength, speed, and endurance are more than advantages. They are shields against injury, weapons in the arena, and measures of survival. The body becomes a project, an evolving machine designed to absorb impact, to deliver force, and to endure punishment that would overwhelm an ordinary person. The paradox is stark. The very practices meant to prepare athletes for combat also push them to the edge of human capacity, sometimes beyond it. Boxers begin with fundamentals, stance, footwork, and conditioning. But beneath the technique lies a regimen designed to harden the body against repeated trauma. Hours in the gym, months in the ring, and years of training cultivate not only muscle and speed, but resilience. Athletes are conditioned to expect the unexpected, to react instinctively, and to maintain composure under extreme stress. The goal is not only physical performance, but the creation of confidence and endurance that can withstand psychological pressure. In boxing, the mind must remain calm while the body absorbs strikes. In football, players must anticipate and react while sustaining collisions at high velocity. The preparation for impact is as mental as it is physical, and the interplay between the two defines success and longevity in both sports. Yet training for violence carries inherent risk. The pursuit of strength and speed exposes athletes to overuse injuries, joint strain, and repetitive stress. In boxing, the hours spent sparring, hitting heavy bags, and rolling with partners contribute to cumulative trauma in shoulders, wrists, and knees. The very mechanisms that make the body resilient also create points of vulnerability. In football, weightlifting, sprinting, and tackling drills place constant pressure on knees, hips, and spinal structures. The pursuit of excellence is inseparable from the potential for breakdown. Athletes must navigate a delicate balance between conditioning and overextension, a balance that is never static and rarely predictable. I have heard athletes describe the psychological rhythm of training for impact. Each session is a rehearsal of danger, a negotiation with pain, and a rehearsal of control. They describe the sense of anticipation as both thrilling and exhausting. the awareness that every strike or collision tests their capacity to endure. For boxers, it is the knowledge that one miscalculation can lead to a knockout, the understanding that the body must be perpetually prepared. For football players, the repetition of contact drills is a recognition that every practice carries potential injury. Training is simultaneously preparation, simulation, and trial by fire. Athletes also describe the obsession with incremental gains. A few extra pounds of muscle, a fraction of a second shaved off a sprint. An improved shoulder rotation, each improvement becomes a margin of safety. Yet the pursuit of these margins demands relentless discipline, sometimes bordering on compulsion. Rest, recovery, and nutrition are regimented with the same intensity as drills. Sleep schedules, caloric intake, and recovery protocols are meticulously managed to maintain peak capacity. The body becomes a controlled environment, a machine honed to perform violent acts repeatedly without failing. In both sports, the concept of the breaking point is ever present. Athletes are trained to know their limits, but also to push past them. Pain becomes a guidepost, signaling both risk and opportunity. I have spoken with players who describe training sessions where every muscle ached, every joint protested, yet they continued, knowing that enduring discomfort is essential to survival. In boxing, the breaking point may come as the first signs of fatigue or dizziness in a sparring round. In football, it is the point when the body can no longer absorb repeated hits without injury. Athletes learn to recognize and respect the threshold, yet often they are required to exceed it, and the consequences are unpredictable. I have observed the ways in which athletes internalize the training process. It becomes part of identity, a ritual that defines character as much as physical capability. Strength is moral as well as functional. Speed is a measure of courage and commitment. Conditioning is a testament to discipline and endurance. Athletes take pride in their ability to withstand the demands of preparation, often viewing weakness as a personal failure. Yet the training itself is a form of controlled trauma, a series of calculated exposures to stress and force that shape not only the body but the mind. The athlete emerges both stronger and more vulnerable, a paradox that underscores the intensity and cost of these sports. Ultimately, the training of the body for impact reveals the intersection of ambition, discipline, and risk. It is a testament to human adaptability and the pursuit of excellence. It is also a testament to the fragility inherent in pushing the human body to extremes. Athletes endure, adapt, and overcome, but the long-term consequences of repeated strain and collision remain ever present. The preparation that allows them to perform at elite levels is inseparable from the potential for cumulative injury. And the very traits that make them successful in the moment also make them susceptible to the hidden costs of violence. I have spent countless hours observing the people who shape athletes, the men and women who guide them, challenge them, and sometimes push them beyond reason. Coaches, trainers, cornermen, and staff are the architects behind the spectacle. They construct not only physical preparation, but also mental toughness, cultural expectation, and professional identity. They are mentors, yes, but also enablers. Their guidance can inspire greatness, but it can also demand endurance at the expense of well-being. The paradox is undeniable. The same individuals who nurture talent also shepherd athletes toward the edges of human capacity, and sometimes beyond. In boxing, the cornermen hold a unique position of influence. They are the eyes in the corner, the voice in the ring, the judge of risk and opportunity. They know when a fighter is struggling physically or mentally. They know when fatigue compromises reflexes or when a bruise signals danger. Yet they also know that careers, reputations, and purses hang in the balance. I have spoken with retired fighters who describe moments in which cornermen encouraged them to continue despite evident injury. The logic was always framed in terms of opportunity and survival. To step back was to forfeit chance. To endure was to embrace risk and the possibility of reward. Cornermen, mentors, and trainers operate within a delicate balance, sometimes saving athletes, sometimes exposing them to harm in the pursuit of glory. Football coaches exert similar influence, though the dynamic is often more diffuse. Strength and conditioning coaches, head coaches, position coaches, and medical staff create an ecosystem in which the athlete exists. Each decision carries consequences. Coaches encourage players to push through minor injuries, to practice at full intensity, to embrace pain as a sign of commitment. The culture within the locker room often reinforces these expectations. Veteran players model behavior that celebrates toughness. Younger players internalize the lessons, observing who earns respect, who ascends, and who is left behind. The mentorship structure in football is intricate. Guidance and pressure are interwoven. Athletes learn not only skills but also the limits of acceptable risk, often absorbing the implicit message that endurance is inseparable from identity. I have interviewed athletes who reflect on the complicated relationships they had with mentors. One boxer recounted a trainer who would scream instructions from the corner, pushing him to take punches in training he did not feel ready to withstand. He described the mix of trust and fear, of knowing that the trainer's intention was to prepare him for competition while also recognizing that his body was vulnerable. The relationship was intimate and intense, a blend of respect, authority, and implicit expectation. The mentor shaped not only his performance, but also his perception of endurance, risk, and responsibility. In football, a similar pattern emerges. Players describe coaches who encouraged them to return from injury too quickly, who glorified pain tolerance, and who celebrated resilience without fully weighing long-term consequences. Medical staff were sometimes complicit, negotiating between preserving health and maintaining competitive performance. Athletes internalized these pressures, balancing trust in their mentors with instinctive concern for safety. The tension between guidance and expectation, mentorship and enabling, is constant. Every encouragement carries weight. Every instruction has consequence. Mentors in both sports are often motivated by a complex mix of loyalty, ambition, and financial incentive. In boxing, a trainer's reputation is tied to the success of fighters. Victory brings prestige, influence, and income. In football, coaches' career trajectories are intertwined with team performance. Wins, playoff appearances, and player development determine reputation, job security, and advancement. Mentorship is therefore inseparable from institutional and personal stakes. Encouragement to endure is not always a product of malice. It is frequently the result of layered incentives where performance, opportunity, and identity intersect. Athletes operate within this ecosystem, internalizing both guidance and expectation. I have seen firsthand the psychological impact of mentors and enablers. Athletes describe a deep reliance on these figures, a trust that shapes decision-making in high-stakes moments. They learn to assess risk through the lens of experience and authority, often overriding personal instinct. The influence is profound. A single word of encouragement, a nod of approval, a call to continue despite warning signs can alter the trajectory of a career. Athletes internalize responsibility, sometimes feeling guilty for perceived weakness or failure, even when guided into danger by trusted mentors. The line between support and exposure to harm is often blurred. In boxing, mentorship extends beyond the physical. Cornermen teach strategy, timing, and situational awareness. They instill confidence while simultaneously testing resilience. Fighters internalize lessons about courage, fortitude, and endurance. The guidance is intimate and constant, shaping both immediate decisions and long-term identity. When a trainer encourages a fighter to take risks, it is framed as preparation for the reality of the ring. The mentorship simultaneously empowers and exposes. The line between protection and endangerment is subtle and often invisible to outsiders. Football's mentorship operates similarly, but across a wider network. Veteran players mentor rookies, passing on lessons learned through experience. Coaches shape decisions regarding play style, conditioning, and recovery. Staff manage nutrition, physical therapy, and mental conditioning. Each interaction reinforces a set of expectations about resilience, toughness, and the acceptability of risk. Athletes absorb these lessons, often internalizing them as moral obligations rather than mere professional advice. The cumulative effect of mentorship is a culture in which endurance and exposure to impact are normalized, valorized, and expected. I have also observed the consequences when mentorship fails or is misaligned. Athletes describe moments in which guidance encouraged dangerous behavior, increased risk, or delayed recognition of injury. Some fighters and players report long-term physical or cognitive consequences linked to these decisions. Yet few blame their mentors outright. The complexity of the relationships, intertwined with trust, respect, and shared ambition renders accountability diffuse. Mentorship is both a mechanism of growth and a conduit of exposure to harm. Athletes navigate this duality constantly, balancing trust with self-preservation. Mentors and enablers are essential to understanding the culture of violence in sport. They transmit knowledge, shape identity, and define the boundaries of endurance. They prepare athletes to perform at extraordinary levels while simultaneously exposing them to risk. The duality of mentorship capacity to protect and to endanger is central to the lived experience of athletes. Understanding their role is essential to understanding why athletes willingly endure physical and psychological stress, why they push their bodies beyond normal limits, and why the culture of these sports perpetuates cycles of sacrifice. Ultimately, the influence of mentors and enablers underscores the human dimension of brutality in sports. Athletes are not reckless by nature. They are guided, encouraged, and reinforced by networks of authority and expertise. These relationships shape perception, dictate acceptable risk, and normalize endurance. Violence in boxing and football is not merely an individual choice. It is cultivated, supported, and sometimes demanded by those who prepare athletes for the arena. The mentor exists at the nexus of guidance and exposure, embodying both care and complicity. Understanding this dynamic reveals the complex social architecture behind endurance, sacrifice, and the human cost of sport. His head felt disconnected from his intentions, his legs heavy, his vision blurred. The crowd's roar faded into a distant hum. He described the moment not as a knockout, but as a realization. He was no longer fully present. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences would unfold quietly, cumulatively, over the years. In football, the breaking point often manifests differently, but is no less definitive. Players describe the sensation of enduring repeated collisions until something snaps physically, neurologically, or emotionally. One linebacker recounted a season in which every practice and game felt heavier than the last. The hits accumulated, each one magnified by fatigue and pain. By mid-season, he could no longer ignore the ringing in his ears, the blurring of vision, the pounding headaches. The body still moved, the mind still processed. But the equilibrium that had allowed him to perform without conscious thought was gone. That season marked a turning point in his career. He would continue to play, but the joy, confidence, and sense of invincibility that defined him were irreversibly altered. Breaking points are rarely publicized. The spectacle of the sport demands that performance continue, that appearances of resilience are maintained. Yet athletes themselves recall the subtle signs: delayed reaction, tremors, cognitive fog, emotional instability. In boxing, a fighter may continue after a round, masking dizziness and disorientation. In football, a player may remain in a game despite blurred vision or ringing ears. The cultural imperative to persist, reinforced by coaches, peers, and internalized identity, often ensures that the breaking point is crossed before recognition occurs. Survival, both in the sport and in the eyes of the audience, requires concealment. I have spoken with athletes who describe the emotional weight of these moments. One retired football player recounted a game in which he felt his body give way mid-play. He executed every movement correctly, responded instinctively, yet internally he sensed fracture. The realization that he had reached a point of irreversible strain was terrifying. He said he felt both awe at the capacity of the human body to continue under duress and fear at the hidden toll. That duality is central to the experience of the breaking point. Wonder at resilience, coupled with apprehension of the unknown consequences. Boxers often articulate the breaking point in terms of control. They describe rounds in which punches accumulate, where the body no longer obeys the mind, and where instinct alone governs action. One former champion described a fight in which he absorbed strikes he would normally have deflected, feeling every blow reverberate through head, torso, and legs. Boxers recount long careers in which repeated punishment leaves subtle but permanent neurological effects. It is a series of thresholds crossed, often unnoticed until the body or mind signals in unmistakable ways. The aftermath of breaking points is as varied as the athletes themselves. Some recover physically, but carry lingering cognitive or emotional effects. Others continue to perform, but report diminished confidence, altered reaction time, or changes in temperament. Many struggle to reconcile the demands of the sport with the awareness of long-term consequences. I have spoken with former players who describe a profound sense of loss of identity, loss of physical capacity, and loss of the unspoken guarantee that their bodies would endure indefinitely. Breaking points leave indelible marks, not only on the body, but on the psyche. I have also noted that the culture of endurance exacerbates the phenomenon. Athletes often rationalize or normalize early warning signs, interpreting fatigue, pain, or disorientation as merely part of the sport. They are conditioned to suppress self-preservation instincts. Coaches, mentors, and peers reinforce the notion that persistence defines worth. The breaking point is therefore both a physiological reality and a cultural construct. Stories of breaking points underscore the human cost of violence in sports. They reveal the hidden thresholds that define careers, identities, and long-term health. One retired boxer reflected that his mind remembers the rounds differently than his body does. The memory of endurance is intact, but the subtle neurological changes are permanent. A former football player described recurring headaches and cognitive gaps that emerged years after his final season, consequences of cumulative hits that had once been normalized. Breaking points, in this sense, are both immediate and delayed. They are moments of acute crisis and the seeds of long-term consequence. I have come to understand that the breaking point is not a singular event, but a spectrum. It can manifest as a momentary loss of control, a season of cumulative strain, or a career-long series of compromises. Athletes live with awareness of the possibility, yet the culture, incentives, and identity tied to endurance compel persistence. The stories I have gathered reveal courage, resilience, and determination. It is the point where training, culture, and identity collide with physiology and psychology. It is where the athlete must reconcile personal survival with professional expectation. The stories of those who have reached these thresholds are a testament to human capacity, a warning of vulnerability. I have watched athletes walk into stadiums, gyms, and locker rooms carrying more than just their gear. They carry pain, injuries, and the quiet knowledge that their bodies are betraying them. Yet they continue to perform, to endure, to deliver results under the scrutiny of coaches, fans, and media. One of the mechanisms that makes this possible, the often visible conduit between injury and endurance, is medication. Painkillers, anti-inflammatories, injections, and other pharmaceutical interventions have become integral to survival in high-impact sports. They allow athletes to push beyond the limits of their bodies, masking the signals that would otherwise demand rest. They blur the line between resilience and vulnerability, between performance and risk. In boxing, fighters frequently arrive at the gym or into the ring with lingering injuries, bruised ribs, sprained ankles, shoulder inflammation, or chronic head trauma. Pain is constant. The body is a map of previous battles, each mark a testament to past endurance. To continue, many rely on pain management strategies sanctioned by medical staff, trainers, and sometimes themselves. Pills taken before training, cortisone injections to reduce inflammation. Topical creams to dull sensation and other interventions are standard practice. The goal is clear. Continue to perform at a level that satisfies expectation, both internal and external. The irony is that these interventions, while enabling short-term survival, often accelerate long-term damage. By dulling warning signals, they create the illusion that the body is capable of feats it is no longer physiologically prepared to endure. Football players face similar realities, though the scale and context are often magnified by the team environment. A single player can experience hundreds of high-impact collisions over the course of a season. Sprains, bruises, joint stress, and concussive events accumulate invisibly. Painkillers and anti-inflammatory medication, administered orally or through injections, have become routine. Players learn to trust their bodies in conjunction with these interventions, to rely on pharmaceutical aids to maintain mobility and effectiveness. In this culture, admitting to pain or injury can be interpreted as weakness, risking position, playing time, or even contracts. The combination of physical strain, cultural expectation, and chemical intervention forms a triad that perpetuates endurance at the expense of health. I have spoken with athletes who describe the tension between relief and awareness. One retired boxer told me that before a championship fight, he relied on injections to manage knee inflammation. The moment the pain faded, he could perform without hesitation, moving freely through combinations and defensive maneuvers. Yet he also knew, consciously, that the injections were masking vulnerability. Every punch absorbed carried the potential for further damage, and the long-term consequences were undeniable. He referred to this process as both liberation and risk. Painkillers allowed survival in the immediate moment, but they deferred the reckoning. Football players recount similar experiences with a clinical detachment that belies the danger. I spoke with a veteran linebacker who described weekly injections to manage lower back inflammation, combined with over-the-counter medication before games and practices. The body, he said, functioned on a chemically altered baseline, capable of enduring collisions that would otherwise be debilitating. He admitted the strategy was necessary to maintain career longevity and competitive performance. Yet he also acknowledged the cumulative toll, the subtle erosion of mobility, the delayed healing, and the latent pain that returned after the season ended. Pain management is survival, but it is not without consequence. The psychological implications of this reliance on medication are profound. Athletes internalize a paradox. The tools that enable survival also mask critical feedback. Pain, normally a signal to rest or adapt, is reinterpreted as manageable or irrelevant. Athletes develop a heightened tolerance for discomfort, yet they simultaneously risk misjudging limits. The body communicates boundaries, but the chemical interventions mute the signal. Awareness of injury persists intellectually, but the physical cues are suppressed. This creates a fragile equilibrium in which performance is sustained at the expense of long-term well-being. I have observed that the culture of endurance reinforces the use of painkillers. Coaches, medical staff, and teammates often implicitly or explicitly condone these practices. The expectation is that the athlete will continue, that the team will function, that the game or fight will proceed. Pharmaceutical aids become an extension of training, a tool as essential as strength conditioning or agility drills. Yet the normalization of these practices obscures the inherent risk. Athletes are operating under chemically mediated resilience, masking injuries that could otherwise be identified, treated, or avoided. The culture encourages not only tolerance, but concealment. Athletes themselves describe a moral dimension to this practice. One football player told me that taking medication to play through pain felt like both necessity and transgression. Necessity, because failure to perform could jeopardize position or opportunity. Transgression, because he knew he was forcing his body into a state of unnatural endurance, ignoring signals that would otherwise demand pause. This duality is central to the experience. Survival is achieved at a personal cost, ethical and physical. A constant negotiation between ambition, obligation, and biological reality. In boxing, the reliance on pain management also intersects with identity and legacy. A fighter who cannot tolerate injury risks being perceived as weak or unprepared. Success is measured not only by victories, but by visible resilience. Painkillers and injections become instruments of cultural survival, allowing the body to perform in ways that align with public expectation and personal ambition. The athlete endures, sometimes at the limit of safety, not only for victory, but to sustain identity and respect. The cost of using these tools is rarely immediate, but the consequences, joint degeneration, neurological damage, chronic pain, merge over time. Long after the applause has faded, football illustrates the broader systemic implications. Teams, leagues, and medical staff structure expectations around performance, injury management, and pharmacological support. Pain is both acknowledged and mitigated, yet rarely eliminated. Players navigate this ecosystem, balancing immediate functionality against long-term health. They rely on medication to fulfill obligations to coaches, fans, and teammates. They also rely on chemical support to maintain personal aspirations. The system is self-reinforcing. The culture of toughness demands endurance. Endurance requires intervention, and intervention normalizes extraordinary risk. Athletes reflect on the tension between dependency and autonomy. One boxer described the anxiety of knowing that without painkillers, he could not compete effectively. Yet with them, he was acutely aware of the deferred consequences. Football players echoed the sentiment. Performance was enabled. Survival facilitated, but awareness of injury remained present. A quiet shadow following each game, each practice, each season. Painkillers and injections are survival tools, yet they come with the knowledge that endurance is chemically mediated, provisional, and costly. The stories converge on a central truth. Survival in violent sports is both physiological and psychological. Pain management allows performance, but it also fosters vulnerability. Athletes operate in a state of suspended judgment, masking signals that would otherwise guide recovery or withdrawal. They endure because culture, ambition, and identity demand it. They survive through chemical intervention, yet survival does not negate cost. The body accrues trauma, often invisible at the time, waiting to manifest when performance is no longer required and the spotlight has dimmed. In the end, painkillers, numbness, and chemical aids are emblematic of the broader tension in violent sports. They are tools that enable survival, but they also blur boundaries, conceal limits, and defer consequences. They illuminate the lengths to which athletes will go to endure, perform, and maintain identity. They reveal the collision of biology, culture, and ambition. Pain becomes negotiable, endurance becomes chemically mediated, and the cost, though postponed, remains inevitable. The business rewards survival, spectacle, and endurance, but it also requires exposure to repeated danger. The athlete becomes both producer and product, sustaining the spectacle that fuels the industry while absorbing the consequences. Sponsorships and endorsements are a critical component of this dynamic. Brands align themselves with athletes who embody toughness, resilience, and the capacity to endure. The perception of invincibility, of pushing limits, becomes a marketable asset. A fighter who continues despite injury, a football player who returns to the field after a series of collisions, is perceived not only as courageous, but as commercially valuable. The rewards can be substantial financial security, global recognition, and career longevity, but they are earned through exposure to repeated danger. The business model and the athlete's health are intertwined in ways that often obscure risk while amplifying reward. Television and media coverage have further intensified this relationship. Broadcasting has transformed both sports, creating global audiences and elevating physical violence into a spectacle consumed by millions. Ratings, advertising revenue, and media contracts are directly influenced by the intensity of play, the drama of endurance, and the visible signs of struggle. In boxing, a fighter's ability to withstand punishment is not merely a measure of skill. It is a feature of narrative and marketability. In football, collisions, sacks, and tackles are replayed, analyzed, and celebrated, generating engagement that fuels networks, merchandise sales, and sponsorship agreements. The business of brutality thrives on visibility and immediacy, magnifying the stakes for athletes in real time. I have also noted the structural pressures created by this ecosystem. Leagues and promoters operate with incentives that prioritize performance over preservation. Contract clauses, performance bonuses, and media obligations encourage athletes to compete even when injured or compromised. Athletes internalize these pressures, often interpreting continued participation as both personal obligation and professional necessity. The industry rewards endurance and spectacle, yet it rarely accounts for long-term health consequences. The commodification of violence creates an environment in which risk is normalized and endurance is monetized. Boxing and football share a paradox in this context. The sports glorify toughness, resilience, and the willingness to endure. Yet the business structures that amplify these traits also exploit vulnerability. Promoters, coaches, sponsors, and media are all invested in the continuation of spectacle. Each play, each round, each fight is part of a carefully constructed narrative designed to captivate audiences and maximize revenue. The business of brutality shapes not only immediate performance, but generational norms, creating a culture in which exposure to danger is normalized, rewarded, and perpetuated. I have come to understand that the commodification of endurance and violence is both subtle and overt. The spectacle is packaged as entertainment, framed as heroism, and consumed as sport. The reality, however, is that the industry depends on human bodies being pushed to extreme limits. Promoters, leagues, sponsors, and media are not malicious, but they are pragmatic. They recognize that physical confrontation drives engagement and revenue. The athlete becomes an instrument in this system, navigating incentives, obligations, Promoters and organizations profit because the cycle perpetuates itself. Violence is commodified, endurance is monetized, and the consequences injury, cognitive decline, and long-term pain remain largely invisible in the moment. The psychological burden is compounded by cultural norms that prize endurance over reflection, silence over disclosure, and toughness over vulnerability. Identity is profoundly affected by the mental toll of violent sports. I have heard athletes struggle with who they are outside the arena. In boxing, a fighter may identify primarily with toughness, resilience, and ability to endure punishment. In football, a player may equate worth with physical dominance, durability, and contribution to team success. When injury, retirement, or cognitive decline disrupts these capacities, identity becomes unstable. Athletes wrestle with the dissonance between the person they were defined as and the person they have become. The psychological strain is inseparable from the physical exposure and cultural reinforcement that shape their self-perception. Fear is another constant companion. It is not always visible, nor is it always acknowledged. Fighters describe fear of permanent injury, of losing reflexes, of failing to meet expectation. Football players report fear of concussion, long-term neurological effects, and career-ending collisions. Yet it shapes decision-making, influences performance, and accumulates over time, contributing to emotional fatigue, hypervigilance, and cognitive strain. The mental load is ongoing, invisible, and cumulative. Aggression is similarly both an asset and a challenge. In the controlled environment of the ring or on the field, aggression is necessary, rewarded, and expected. Yet the line between functional aggression and psychological strain is thin. Repeated exposure to violent encounters can exacerbate irritability, impulsivity, and emotional volatility. Athletes often recognize these changes, describing difficulty regulating anger off the field or beyond the ring. The mental consequences are intertwined with the culture of violence, identity construction, and the social expectation to perform under extreme physical and psychological stress. I have encountered athletes who acknowledge the interplay between their mental health and medication or pain management strategies. Chemical interventions that mask physical pain often conceal the psychological impact as well, creating a sense of temporary relief while underlying anxiety, depression, and cognitive strain persist. Retired athletes, in particular, describe delayed recognition of mental health consequences, a reckoning that occurs once physical performance is no longer the defining metric of identity. The psychological residue of repeated exposure to violence often emerges years after the arena has closed, compounding feelings of isolation, helplessness, or disorientation. Isolation is another aspect of the mental toll. Athletes in both boxing and football frequently describe experiences in which they feel separated from those who do not share the same pressures, traumas, or cultural norms. Teammates, opponents, and trainers are often the only ones who can relate. Yet even within these circles, discussion of mental strain is limited. Pride, toughness, and professional expectation can prevent open acknowledgement of vulnerability. The result is a culture in which mental suffering is hidden, endured privately, and often untreated, amplifying the psychological consequences of participation in violent sports. I have also reflected on the cumulative effect of repeated exposure to traumatic events. Each fight, collision, or high-impact play adds to the psychological burden, reinforcing anxiety, aggression, and hypervigilance. Athletes describe experiencing these effects simultaneously with physical pain, creating complex, interdependent stressors. The mind and body are entangled in a continuous feedback loop, where physical trauma exacerbates mental strain and psychological stress can heighten sensitivity to injury. Understanding the mental toll requires recognition of this interplay, of the interdependent effects of violence, endurance, and identity construction. Ultimately, the mental toll is inseparable from the culture and structure of the sport. Anxiety, depression, aggression, and identity crisis are not isolated consequences. They are the product of an environment that rewards endurance, valorizes risk, and normalizes exposure to trauma. Athletes endure, perform, and sacrifice, but the cost is rarely visible to spectators, rarely addressed by organizations, and often misunderstood by the public. Mental strain is cumulative, pervasive, and enduring, a shadow companion to every physical encounter, every hit, every punch, and every collision. In the final analysis, the mental toll of violent sports illuminates the human cost that extends far beyond the physical arena. The resilience celebrated by audiences and rewarded by institutions is inseparable from the psychological burden carried in silence. Anxiety, fear, aggression, depression, and identity disruption are integral to the experience of athletes navigating the brutal intersection of performance, expectation, and risk. Recognizing this reality is essential to understanding not only the spectacle of sport, but also the invisible, enduring consequences that define the lives of those who dedicate themselves to endurance in the pursuit of competition and recognition. I have often reflected on the audience as an invisible force in the calculus of brutality. Fans are not merely spectators. They are participants in a system that thrives on risk, endurance, and spectacle. Their cheers, engagement, and consumption of the sport create the conditions under which violence is both celebrated and sustained. Boxers and football players alike recognize this dynamic. The crowd demands courage and resilience, applauds endurance through pain, and rewards the very behaviors that expose athletes to risk. Yet, paradoxically, the same public frequently turns away from the consequences: neurological decline, chronic pain, and psychological trauma. The audience shapes the sport as much as the athletes themselves, yet rarely bears witness to the full human cost. In boxing, the tension between audience expectation and physical reality is especially acute. Fights are structured around rounds, scoring, and spectacle, but the emotional payoff is tied to risk. The public wants to see endurance tested, the ability to absorb and deliver punishment, the courage to continue even when the body is failing. Fans cheer when a fighter rises from a knockdown, when a knockout punch lands, when the body and mind are stretched to their limits. The applause reinforces the culture of risk, encouraging athletes to push beyond safe thresholds. The audience is not neutral. It is a participant in perpetuating both spectacle and risk. Fans express admiration for toughness and resilience, yet recoil at the visible evidence of long-term harm. In boxing, audiences cheer when a fighter absorbs punishment to achieve victory. Yet the discussions about cumulative brain injury remain muted. In football, tackles that test human limits are replayed endlessly, while concussion protocols and long-term consequences are frequently minimized in public discourse. The audience both fuels and neglects the human cost. Athletes internalize this paradox. One retired football player admitted he felt compelled to continue playing despite warning signs of injury because the audience expected it. The roar of fans, the spotlight of television, and the validation of public attention created pressure that rivaled the physical demands of the sport. A boxer expressed similar sentiment, noting that the weight of audience expectation dictated behavior, encouraged risk, and reinforced endurance beyond safe limits. The public's attention is both motivating and coercive, shaping choices in ways that are subtle, pervasive, and often invisible to the observers themselves. I have also reflected on the generational consequences of public expectation. Young athletes grow up consuming highlights, emulating heroes, and internalizing lessons about toughness, resilience, and risk. They learn that enduring pain, absorbing punishment, and performing despite injury are socially and culturally rewarded behaviors. The public's appetite for spectacle, violence, and endurance creates a feedback loop. The audience celebrates extreme performance, athletes conform to expectation, and the cycle reinforces itself across generations. This influence is not merely cultural, it is structural, shaping the sport, the athletes, and the nature of participation itself. The public's complicity is not deliberate or malicious, it is structural and psychological. Spectators seek entertainment, inspiration, and emotional investment. Yet the patterns of consumption, attention, and praise reinforce a system in which risk is expected, exposure to harm is normalized, and long-term consequences are obscured. Athletes are aware, often painfully, that endurance is both celebrated and exploited, and that the audience's gaze can simultaneously motivate and endanger. Understanding this dynamic is essential to understanding the full ecosystem of violent sports, in which human vulnerability is mediated by expectation, applause, and engagement. I have listened to retired athletes describe the cognitive dissonance that accompanies audience interaction. They recount moments of triumph, appreciation, and celebration. Yet these moments are juxtaposed against private reflection on the cost of performance. One former boxer reflected that victories in the ring were bittersweet because the body and mind had paid a toll largely invisible to the audience. A former football player recounted the exhilaration of crowd reaction tempered by awareness of injuries that would manifest long after applause faded. The public is both participant and observer, shaping outcomes while remaining largely insulated from consequences. Ultimately, the public's role is inseparable from the cycle of endurance and risk. Fans demand courage, toughness, and spectacle. They reward resilience, valor, and physical dominance. They consume, replay, and celebrate feats of performance while often ignoring long-term consequences. Athletes respond to these expectations, navigating pressures that are cultural, economic, and psychological. The audience drives the spectacle of brutality while maintaining a distance from the human cost, creating a complex interplay between desire, entertainment, and vulnerability. Recognizing this dynamic is critical. The public is not merely an audience, but a participant in the culture of violence, a force that shapes behavior, culture, and expectation. Athletes endure because they are celebrated, sustained by the attention, approval, and engagement of spectators. At the same time, the consequences of endurance, injury, and psychological strain remain largely invisible. The public's role is both enabling and obscuring, demanding spectacle while overlooking cost, celebrating courage while turning away from the toll. In the final analysis, spectatorship is inseparable from the realities of violent sports. Anxiety, injury, and endurance are magnified, structured, and perpetuated by public expectation. Fans, through attention, applause, and engagement, shape the environment in which athletes operate, perform, and endure. Understanding this complicity is essential to understanding the culture of violence, the experience of athletes, and the human cost of the spectacle. The public is both audience and participant. It's complicit in celebrating endurance while often ignoring consequence, shaping both culture and risk in equal measure. The narrative constructed by television, radio, print, and now digital platforms influences public expectation, athletic behavior, and even league policies. Media evolution is inseparable from the endurance and exposure of athletes. In the early days of boxing, newspapers described bouts with visceral attention to detail. The framing of violence as heroic and commendable reinforced cultural norms. Toughness was not only expected, but celebrated. The pen, in effect, became a tool to codify acceptable forms of risk, establishing a standard for both fans and fighters. Collisions and punches could be examined frame by frame, highlighting both technical skill and the force of impact. This visual clarity intensified engagement while simultaneously shaping perception. Fans came to expect not only skill, but visible signs of endurance, resilience, and physical confrontation. I have spoken with retired athletes who reflect on the subtle pressures created by media framing. One former boxer described feeling compelled to absorb punishment and continue despite injury because every moment was potentially broadcast and analyzed. A retired football player echoed this, noting that collisions, plays, and endurance were dissected on television and social media, creating pressure to sustain performance regardless of physical condition. The evolution of digital media has intensified these dynamics. Social platforms, highlight reels, and viral clips create a continuous cycle of engagement and consumption. Fans can replay moments of extraordinary endurance, admire technical skill under duress, and participate in the collective celebration of toughness. Visibility creates career-defining moments, endorsements, and financial reward. Broadcast, marketing, and narrative framing create a system in which endurance, risk, and toughness are valued, normalized, and rewarded. Audiences internalize these cues, leagues structure incentives around them, and athletes perform within this complex network of expectation and exposure. Violence becomes not only spectacle, but a cultural currency, framed, consumed, and perpetuated by the evolving media landscape. Recognizing the media's role is essential to understanding the full architecture of brutal sports. The evolution of coverage, marketing, and narrative framing shapes perception, behavior, and expectation in ways that extend far beyond individual contests or careers. Fans consume because framing presents endurance as heroic and violence as compelling. I've always been fascinated by the moments when brutality intersects with identity, history, and legacy. Rivalries define sports, but in violent arenas like football and boxing, they become crucibles where careers are forged, reputations are tested, and personal narratives are written in blood and sweat. these rivalries are more than competition. They are moral and psychological tests. They are measures of resilience, fortitude, and capacity to endure extreme punishment. They are also moments of redemption, when athletes reclaim agency after injury, loss, or public doubt. The collision of rivalry and brutality produces stories that linger far beyond the scoreboards, shaping the culture and history of the sport itself. In boxing, rivalries have always been intensely personal, often framed as battles not just between athletes, but between contrasting styles, ideologies, or generations. I have listened to fighters describe the psychological weight of facing an opponent who represents not only a threat in the ring, but a challenge to personal pride and identity. One legendary rivalry saw fighters trading brutal blows over multiple bouts, each encounter testing physical limits and mental fortitude. The narrative of revenge and redemption became inseparable from the actual acts of violence. Every punch landed and absorbed contributed to the broader story of endurance and triumph, framing careers in terms of resilience under extreme stress. In many cases, these contests provide moments of redemption. I have heard athletes describe the satisfaction of returning from injury or personal setback to perform at peak level in the crucible of a rivalry. Boxing matches often feature comebacks, where a fighter absorbs punishment early, adjusts strategy, and prevails through endurance and skill. Football players similarly recount games in which overcoming pain and injury becomes both a literal and symbolic victory. Redemption is tied to survival, performance, and the ability to endure brutality while asserting personal and professional identity. These moments are celebrated by fans, media, and the athletes themselves, creating narratives that transcend individual games or fights. I have observed that rivalries magnify consequences. The physical and mental toll of preparing for and competing in high-stakes contests is magnified by the emotional intensity of personal or historical animosity. Athletes report elevated stress, increased risk-taking, and heightened awareness of potential injury. In boxing, this can mean absorbing repeated blows in pursuit of victory. In football, it can mean prioritizing performance over personal safety, participating in plays that carry disproportionate risk. Rivalries do not simply test skill, they test endurance, resilience, and willingness to endure violence for legacy. The stakes are not abstract. They are embodied in every collision and every round. I have also reflected on how rivalries shape culture. Fans, media, and organizations reinforce the significance of these contests, amplifying narratives of endurance, revenge, and redemption. Legendary bouts or games become reference points for future generations, teaching young athletes that bravery is measured in pain absorbed and risk endured. Rivalries establish benchmarks for heroism and toughness, linking cultural memory to episodes of extreme physical and psychological exposure. The stories endure long after the athletes retire, embedding lessons about resilience, risk, and redemption into the fabric of the sport. I have noted that rivalries frequently intersect with personal identity and social narrative. In boxing, a fighter may see a rival as the embodiment of a particular style, a generational challenge, or a symbolic opponent. In football, a team or player may represent historical dominance, cultural significance, or local pride. The violence inherent in these contests is therefore amplified by meaning. Every blow carries stakes beyond the immediate play. Every collision becomes a statement about endurance, courage, and legitimacy. Athletes navigate these dual pressures of performance and narrative, aware that both will be judged long after the physical contest concludes. In examining these stories, I have found that redemption is inseparable from exposure. The athlete who suffers injury, absorbs punishment, or struggles psychologically must endure not only physical consequences, but cultural and narrative judgment. Victory, survival, or personal triumph validates endurance and reinforces identity. Loss, injury, or failure leaves a narrative vacuum that may haunt the athlete for years. Rivalries crystallize this dynamic. Brutality is no longer just a sport. It is a test of legacy, identity, and resilience under the watchful eyes of fans, media, and history. Ultimately, Rivalries and Redemption illuminate the complex relationship between violence, identity, and culture. They show that brutality is not merely incidental to sport. It is central to narratives of endurance, recognition, and legacy. The spectacle is both cultural and personal, economic and psychological. Athletes endure because the moment demands it, because legacy and reputation are tied to performance under extreme pressure, and because redemption is inseparable from exposure to risk. Rivalries crystallize the stakes, demonstrating both the human capacity for resilience and the profound cost of sustaining violence in pursuit of identity and legacy. I have concluded that these contests reveal more than skill or strategy. They expose the essence of endurance, courage, and personal transformation. Rivalries force athletes to confront the limits of their bodies and minds, to navigate pain while performing at the highest level, and to reconcile personal ambition with collective expectation. Redemption, when achieved, is a testament to resilience, a narrative constructed through brutality, and a story that lingers far beyond the arena. These moments define careers, shape culture, and highlight the intersection of violence, identity, and history in ways that are deeply human and profoundly consequential. Scar tissue remains. Joints bear the memory of repeated impact, and cognitive systems often retain the residual effects of repeated concussions. Recovery is measured, but it is rarely complete. Football presents a similar yet distinct set of challenges. Injuries are often cumulative rather than singular. the result of subconcussive impacts, repetitive collisions, and sustained stress on joints and ligaments. Recovery science has made strides in assessing these cumulative effects. Advanced imaging, biomechanical analysis, and personalized conditioning programs allow teams to monitor the body in real time and intervene before catastrophic failure occurs. Pain management strategies, including therapeutic injections, targeted rehabilitation exercises, and conditioning regimens, extend careers and mitigate risk. Athletes can recover from injury with remarkable efficiency, but the body retains the memory of each collision, each tackle, and each strain. There are limits to even the most advanced interventions. I have observed that recovery is as much psychological as it is physical. Athletes describe returning from injury not only in terms of tissue repair, but in terms of confidence, readiness, and mental resilience. In boxing, this can mean weeks spent rebuilding stamina, strengthening connective tissue, and retraining reflexes after a concussive event. In football, it may involve rigorous rehabilitation protocols, controlled return-to-play exercises, and continuous evaluation of neurological function. Each cycle is embedded with risk. Returning too soon may exacerbate injury. Delaying return may impact opportunity or career trajectory. Recovery is therefore strategic, clinical, and psychological. Medical professionals emphasize that recovery science has advanced but cannot eliminate uncertainty. Every advancement extends the margin of safety, but does not eliminate exposure. Every protocol allows continuation, but not invincibility. Athletes are acutely aware that their performance depends on this delicate balance, leveraging every medical advantage while accepting the inherent vulnerability of the human body. Recovery is a negotiation with biology, history, and expectation. In the final analysis, the science of recovery is both remarkable and constrained. Modern medicine allows athletes to extend careers, mitigate risk, and repair injury with precision once unimaginable. Yet the body retains memory, the brain retains trauma, and the limits of endurance are undeniable. Boxing and football are played within these boundaries, where every recovery is temporary. Every repair provisional, and every return to competition a calculated confrontation with vulnerability. Understanding the limits of healing is essential to understanding the human cost of performance and the bravery required to continue in the face of inherent danger. Recovery science illuminates resilience, strategy, and innovation, yet it also underscores the enduring fragility of the human athlete. Physical and psychological restoration coexist with unavoidable consequence, and the pursuit of performance exists within these constraints. The athlete navigates risk, expectation, and possibility through both modern science and personal fortitude. Every return to competition is a testament to endurance, preparation, and courage, yet also a reminder of the finite capacity of the human body and mind. I have often reflected on the moment an athlete realizes that the game will never be the same. It is a quiet recognition, rarely witnessed, that the body or mind has shifted irrevocably. In boxing and football, this realization is both emotional and physical. It is a reckoning with accumulated trauma, a confrontation with vulnerability, and an acknowledgement that endurance has a limit. The final season is a turning point, a chapter in which the stakes are no longer solely external, but deeply internal. It is a season defined not by accolades or statistics, but by the intimate knowledge that the athlete can never fully reclaim who they once were. In boxing, the final season often begins subtly. The reflexes are slower, the endurance slightly diminished, the tolerance for punishment lower than it once was. I have spoken with retired fighters who described the first time they took a blow that lingered in memory, a punch that altered timing and confidence. These were not career-ending moments by conventional measure, yet they signaled a shift in the body's threshold. Every subsequent fight carried the weight of awareness, the mind tracking vulnerability, the body betraying its past resilience. The final season is a combination of calculation and surrender, an acknowledgement that survival has become an act of strategy rather than pure strength. Football presents a different but equally stark reality. I have listened to players recount the first time they felt a hit reverberate not just through the body, but into the psyche. The final season is often marked by micro-injuries that accumulate, subtle declines in reaction time, or persistent joint pain that no treatment fully alleviates. It is the season in which the athlete recognizes that enduring hits is no longer sustainable without consequence. The final season is less about performance in the traditional sense and more about survival, mental calculation, and reconciliation with limitation. I have observed that the recognition of decline is both isolating and profoundly human. Athletes describe moments of reflection in quiet locker rooms or empty gyms, where the realization emerges without fanfare or acknowledgement. There is no crowd to cheer this awareness, no applause to validate the internal reckoning. In boxing, it is the solitary moment before a fight, the brief pause in the center of the ring when experience and vulnerability converge. In football, it is the quiet walk to the sideline, observing the impact on teammates while measuring one's own capacity. I have also noticed that the final season carries a paradoxical combination of fear and liberation. The awareness of limitation is accompanied by the clarity to make deliberate choices, to prioritize health over spectacle, to accept that the game will continue without the same level of risk tolerated in previous years. Retired athletes describe this as both frightening and empowering. Frightening because it signals decline. Empowering because it allows control, reflection, and eventual closure. The final season is a nuanced intersection of vulnerability, strategy, and acceptance. Memory plays a critical role in the final season. I have spoken with players who carry vivid recollections of every injury, every knockout, every collision that has contributed to this moment of recognition. The mind catalogs trauma, both physical and emotional, creating a lens through which every subsequent play or fight is viewed. In boxing, fighters anticipate impact with an acute awareness of historical vulnerability, adjusting strategy in real time. In football, players navigate the field with constant assessment of risk versus reward, balancing aggression against long-term survival. The final season is defined by this integration of experience, foresight, and self-preservation. The emotional landscape of the final season is equally profound. Athletes describe grief for lost capability, frustration at limitations, and occasionally guilt for past decisions that have left the body or mind compromised. There is mourning for the career that cannot be reclaimed, for the identity tied to peak performance, and for the audience that will never fully understand the internal reckoning. Yet there is also pride and resilience, acknowledgement of sacrifice, and recognition of accomplishment. The final season is both elegy and celebration, a testament to endurance, courage, and humanity under extreme conditions. I have also reflected on how the final season influences relationships with teammates, coaches, and opponents. In boxing, the fighter may engage with younger opponents or protégés, passing lessons learned from vulnerability and endurance. In football, the veteran player may mentor teammates, adapting play style to compensate for physical limitations while contributing experience and strategic insight. The final season redefines contribution. It is no longer solely measured in points, knockouts, or yards gained, but in leadership, wisdom, and the embodiment of resilience under evolving capacity. Financial and cultural pressures compound the final season. I have observed athletes who continue, despite risk, motivated by contract obligations, endorsements, or personal pride. These pressures interact with the physical realities of decline, creating a tension between external expectation and internal assessment. Decisions are not solely personal. They are mediated by economic, social, and institutional forces. The final season is therefore a negotiation balancing desire, obligation, and the awareness of vulnerability. It is a season in which the athlete's judgment is tested as acutely as their body. Ultimately, the final season is a human story framed by extreme circumstances. It is the recognition that endurance has limits, that vulnerability is inescapable, and that identity is intertwined with both performance and decline. Athletes navigate this season with a combination of strategy, reflection, and courage, reconciling past glory with present limitation. It is a chapter defined not by spectacle alone, but by introspection, resilience, and the quiet acknowledgement of cost. The final season is the culmination of a lifetime spent in arenas of brutality, and it leaves an indelible imprint on both the athlete and the sport itself. The final season also illuminates broader truths about human fragility and adaptation. I have spent countless hours listening to athletes recount the moment the cheering fades and the arena's empty, when the roar of the crowd is replaced by silence and the reality of life after the arena begins to settle in. Retirement from violent sports is rarely a clean departure. It is a transition fraught with complexity, physical decline, financial uncertainty, psychological adjustment, and the challenge of redefining identity beyond the metrics of performance that once dictated daily life. In boxing, retirement often follows a final fight that carries both resolution and ambiguity. The body may be battered, the brain still absorbing residual trauma, and the joints and connective tissue bearing the memory of every impact. Physical decline is immediate, undeniable, and often painful. Simple tasks, once effortless, become reminders of the toll exacted by a career spent in repeated confrontation with extreme force. The arena, once a space of triumph and expression, becomes a reference point for what has been lost, both physically and emotionally. Football presents a similar, though differently structured, post-career reality. I have listened to former players describe lives shaped by repeated collisions, subconcussive hits, and long-term musculoskeletal strain. Chronic pain, mobility limitations, and neurological consequences frequently accompany the transition to retirement. Life outside of stadiums and locker rooms demands new routines, redefined priorities, and often, a confrontation with vulnerability previously managed through performance. For many, the body's memory of impact is constant, a persistent reminder that endurance comes at an irreversible cost. I have observed that financial pressures often accompany physical and psychological challenges. While some athletes accumulate wealth during their careers, many struggle with economic instability upon retirement. Boxing purses, NFL contracts, and endorsement deals can provide temporary security, but rarely guarantee lifelong stability, particularly for those who have invested heavily in lifestyle or face unanticipated medical expenses. Athletes confront bills for ongoing treatment, rehabilitation, and lifestyle adjustment, even as their income from sport ceases. Financial stress compounds physical vulnerability, creating a layered reality that many athletes navigate with limited guidance. The psychological dimension of life after the arena is equally complex. I have heard retired athletes describe feelings of loss, isolation, and disorientation. The structure, identity, and purpose that once centered around training, competition, and performance are suddenly absent. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of invisibility are common companions. In boxing, the fighter may struggle with the absence of ritualized conflict, the intensity of preparation, and the public stage. In football, players often experience a vacuum where teamwork, collective purpose, and adrenaline-driven engagement once existed. Life after the arena demands new strategies for meaning, identity, and fulfillment. Reinvention becomes a central theme. I have observed athletes seeking new careers, coaching opportunities, media roles, or entrepreneurial ventures as mechanisms to reclaim agency and purpose. Some transition into mentoring younger athletes, offering guidance grounded in experience, while others pursue education or business endeavors. Reinvention is rarely easy. It requires translating skill, discipline, and resilience developed in extreme physical contexts into domains with different challenges, rewards, and limitations. Yet for those who succeed, becomes a testimony to adaptability and the human capacity to reconstruct identity beyond the arena. Physical decline remains a persistent reality. I have listened to athletes describe ongoing pain, joint degradation, and neurological symptoms that follow them well into retirement. Simple daily activities, once taken for granted, become reminders of the cost of sustained violence. Even with medical intervention, rehabilitation, and ongoing care, the body carries the history of performance. These limitations are both a challenge and a narrative anchor, shaping choices, lifestyle, and the rhythm of daily life. Life after the arena requires negotiating the body's history while embracing new capacities and routines. Social relationships are also profoundly affected. I have spoken with retired athletes who experience shifts in family dynamics, friendships, and community engagement. Intense careers often isolate athletes from broader social development, and reintegration into everyday life can be complicated. Spouses, children, and friends become central figures in the adaptation process, providing both support and challenge. For many, life after the arena demands rebuilding or renegotiating relationships in ways that accommodate physical limitations, emotional complexity, and the legacies of career identity. I have reflected on the paradox of legacy in post-career life. Athletes are celebrated for endurance, risk, and spectacle while active, yet recognition often diminishes with retirement. The cultural spotlight fades, leaving personal reflection, health, and adaptation as the primary focus. Athletes navigate this transition with varying degrees of success. Some find fulfillment in contribution, mentorship, or creative endeavors. Others struggle with obscurity, financial instability, and the ongoing consequences of trauma. The arena leaves an indelible imprint, both a source of pride and an enduring challenge in life after performance. I've also noted the role of public perception. Fans often remember highlights, victories, and moments of exceptional resilience, rarely attending to the ongoing struggle that follows retirement. Media attention shifts to new athletes and narratives, creating a cultural invisibility for those whose careers have ended. Athletes confront the tension between personal history and collective memory, reconciling the physical and psychological reality of life after the arena with the simplified stories celebrated in public discourse. Recognition may be delayed or incomplete, yet the personal narrative remains vivid, enduring, and profoundly consequential. Ultimately, life after the arena is a testament to the complexity of human resilience. It is an ongoing negotiation with physical limitation, emotional recalibration, financial strategy, and identity reconstruction. Athletes confront the consequences of years of exposure to extreme violence, balancing memory, ongoing health challenges, and the pursuit of new purpose. Life after performance is neither linear nor simple. It is a multidimensional journey, defined by adaptation, reflection, and the constant weighing of consequence against potential. Life after the arena illuminates the full human costs of violent sports. It underscores that the spectacle witnessed by millions is only a portion of the narrative. The aftermath: chronic pain, cognitive decline, financial pressure, and social recalibration is equally significant. Athletes who navigate this space demonstrate not only the resilience of endurance, but also the courage of reinvention. The stories of life after the arena reveal that the human spirit persists even when physical limits impose new constraints. In conclusion, the arena does not conclude with the final whistle or last bell. Its impact endures in body, mind, and identity. Retirement in boxing and football is a complex, layered, and deeply human process. Athletes reconstruct purpose, navigate consequence, and redefine identity in the absence of performance. The challenges are real, the costs profound, and the adaptation remarkable. Life after the arena is not merely an epilogue, it is an ongoing testament to endurance, resilience, and the human capacity to find meaning beyond spectacle. Its imprint endures in the bodies, minds, and memories of the athletes who risk everything for performance. In the myths and stories that circulate through culture, and in the lessons that ripple through future generations. Legacy is not merely a measure of victory or defeat. It is the sum total of endurance, consequence, and cultural memory. The violence endured, absorbed, and witnessed becomes part of a broader narrative about human capacity, risk, and identity. In boxing, the stories of past champions echo with both glory and consequence. I have listened to fighters describe the duality of their legacy, the pride of achievement, and the permanent mark left by accumulated trauma. Every punch absorbed, every bout endured, contributes not only to the athlete's career, but to a historical record of risk and resilience. The legacy of brutality is interwoven with triumph and suffering, creating a narrative that is both celebrated and sobering. The memory of these careers persists in the stories told by fans, the analysis of historians, and the cautionary tales shared among younger fighters. It is a legacy as much about endurance and sacrifice as it is about technique or record. Football, similarly, carries the weight of physical consequence into legacy. I have observed former players reflecting on careers defined by repeated collisions, concussive and subconcussive impacts, and the relentless demands of a sport that prizes performance over preservation. These athletes carry both tangible and intangible markers of the violence they endured: joint degradation, neurological symptoms, and chronic pain, alongside cultural recognition and historical significance. The legacy of brutality in football is therefore complex. Embedded in both the public narrative of success and the private experience of consequence, it is remembered not only through statistics, highlights, and championships, but through the stories of survival, resilience, and the negotiation of risk. I have also considered how legacy shapes culture and expectation. Young athletes, spectators, and society at large internalize the narratives of past brutality, creating benchmarks for toughness, endurance, and courage. Boxing and football teach lessons about resilience and fortitude, but they also normalize exposure to extreme risk. Fans celebrate the spectacle without always acknowledging the long-term cost. Coaches and organizations transmit the values of sacrifice, toughness, and perseverance, reinforcing cycles in which the human body is repeatedly tested. Legacy, therefore, is both historical and forward-looking, informing culture, identity, and expectation. Memory plays a critical role in the legacy of brutality. I have listened to retired athletes recount pivotal moments in their careers, the fights that defined them, the games that tested every limit, the injuries that left indelible marks. These memories are vivid and enduring, shaping personal identity long after public recognition has faded. In boxing, the sequence of blows, the rounds that tested endurance, and the moments of triumph or vulnerability remain etched in both mind and body. In football, the collisions, the hard-fought victories, and the sacrifices endured in practice and game become a living record of the human cost of performance. Legacy is inseparable from memory. I have reflected on how myth is constructed around brutality. Stories of legendary fighters and iconic players often emphasize courage, resilience, and spectacle, sometimes minimizing or overlooking the personal cost. Cultural narratives elevate the heroic, the dramatic, and the victorious, shaping perception and expectation. Yet beneath the myth, the consequences are real: the neurological decline, joint damage, and emotional burden that accompanies sustained exposure to violence. It reveals the interplay between risk, identity, and history, showing how careers built on extreme physical exposure create both personal and societal narratives. Athletes leave behind more than statistics. They leave lessons about resilience, sacrifice, and the cost of performance at the limits of human capacity. Memory, myth, and cultural expectation are intertwined with the physiological, psychological, and emotional realities of the sport. Legacy is therefore multidimensional. It is personal, historical, and cultural all at once. In conclusion, the legacy of brutality is inseparable from the human experience within these sports. Boxing and football do not merely entertain. They expose the limits of endurance, the consequences of risk, and the complexities of identity under extreme pressure. Athletes endure, adapt, and persist, leaving behind narratives that inform culture, shape expectation, and educate future generations. Legacy is the sum of memory, myth, consequence, and achievement. It reminds us that the spectacle of performance carries costs, both visible and hidden, and that the endurance of athletes is inseparable from the enduring lessons they impart. I have heard stories of triumph intertwined with suffering, of glory shadowed by pain, and of lives reshaped by the cumulative effects of choice and circumstance. The cost is measurable in statistics, in medical records, in documented injuries. But it is also deeply personal, intangible, and often invisible to those outside the arena. The narrative of brutality in sport is not merely about spectacle or performance. It is about human resilience, confronted by the inevitability of vulnerability. I have observed the relentless drive to endure, the willingness to confront pain, and the determination to continue despite every warning. Every bruise, every neurological tremor signaling limits. The cost is not limited to the physical. It is emotional, psychological, and social. They endure cultural and economic pressures that magnify risk and limit choice. Honoring these sacrifices requires acknowledgement of both courage and consequence, without the temptation to romanticize the danger or diminish the cost. The human spirit is remarkable, but the vulnerability of the body is equally undeniable. I have also considered the ethical dimensions embedded in this legacy of brutality. Fans, organizations, coaches, and cultural expectation all shape the context in which these sports are performed. There is a tension between admiration for endurance and responsibility for safety, between celebration of spectacle and awareness of consequence. The cost of performance is not borne equally by all stakeholders. Athletes face the immediate physical and psychological risk, while audiences, media, and institutions consume the spectacle and celebrate achievement. Recognizing this imbalance is part of honoring the human cost, understanding the social context, and appreciating the courage required to engage in these sports. Science and medicine have evolved to mitigate risk, yet the limits of the body remain constant. I've reflected on advancements in neurological monitoring, rehabilitation, conditioning, and preventive care. These innovations allow careers to extend, injuries to heal more effectively, and long-term consequences to be managed with greater precision. Yet they cannot erase the fundamental vulnerability inherent in extreme physical competition. Every recovery is provisional. Every return to performance carries a measure of risk. Every choice to continue reflects both determination and acceptance of danger. The human cost is mitigated but never eliminated. And the ethical dimension of participation remains complex and unresolved. Life after the arena adds another layer of reflection. Retirement from violent sports is rarely a relief from consequence. I have observed athletes confronting chronic pain, neurological decline, financial stress, and the challenge of redefining purpose. Reinvention is often necessary, but rarely straightforward. The public memory of performance fades more quickly than the physical and psychological realities that persist. Life after sport highlights the enduring impact of brutality, the lasting significance of the choices made in pursuit of competition, and the necessity of adaptation, resilience, and support. The cost of violence does not conclude with retirement. It extends across a lifetime. Yet within this acknowledgement of consequence, there is also admiration. I have witnessed extraordinary resilience, discipline, and courage. I have listened to athletes describe navigating injury, pain, and psychological stress while maintaining excellence, pursuing mastery, and honoring personal and cultural expectations. The human capacity to endure, adapt, and perform at extremes is remarkable. The legacy of these sports is not solely one of suffering. It is also a testament to determination, sacrifice, and the pursuit of human potential in its rawest, most tested form. I have contemplated the lessons this legacy imparts. Spectacle is inseparable from consequence. Excellence requires endurance, but endurance carries cost. Culture and expectation shape the parameters in which athletes operate, often creating tension between ambition and vulnerability. Safety, ethics, and responsibility are essential to understanding and honoring these sports. Yet they coexist with a long tradition of risk, spectacle, and cultural admiration for toughness. Recognition of cost, therefore, is part of both analysis and empathy, requiring an understanding of history, science, and human behavior. The story of brutality in sport is also a story of humanity. It illuminates our fascination with endurance, our admiration for resilience, and our willingness to celebrate performance at the limits of capacity. Yet it also challenges us to consider responsibility, ethics, and consequence. Athletes embody both the extraordinary potential and the inevitable fragility of the human body and mind. Their careers and legacies are defined not only by victory, spectacle, and fame, but also by pain, loss, and adaptation. The human cost is inseparable from the spectacle. Understanding this duality is essential to honoring their stories and reflecting on the broader cultural context. As I conclude this reflection, I return to the individuals at the center of these narratives. I think of the fighters who walked into the ring knowing every punch carried risk. I think of football players who stepped onto the field understanding the cumulative impact of repeated collisions. I think of the retired athletes facing ongoing physical and psychological challenges, negotiating identity, purpose, and consequence in the absence of performance. Their stories reveal courage, resilience, and complexity. yet they also demand acknowledgement of the human cost of violence, endurance, and cultural expectation. Ultimately, the future of brutality in sports is inseparable from these narratives. Awareness of consequence, advancement in medical science, and ethical consideration can shape practices, rules, and culture. Understanding human limits, recognizing cost, and valuing well-being alongside performance are essential to preserving both safety and spectacle. Athletes will continue to test the edges of capacity, but society has the responsibility to honor their courage while minimizing avoidable harm. The human cost must be acknowledged, measured, and respected in every aspect of sport. In the end, the story of violence, endurance, and legacy is not merely about statistics, records, or highlights. It is about the human experience, the resilience, sacrifice, and courage required to perform at extremes. The vulnerability inherent in every choice, and the lasting impact on body, mind, and identity. Boxing and football reveal the extraordinary potential and profound cost of human endeavor. They teach lessons about resilience, responsibility, and the complex interplay between ambition and limitation. They are stories of courage shadowed by consequence, triumph intertwined with suffering, and humanity tested at the edges of capacity. The human cost, the ethical dimension, the emotional weight, and the enduring consequences form a narrative that extends far beyond the arena. Honoring these athletes requires reflection, empathy, and acknowledgement of the complexity of their experiences. It requires recognizing the price of endurance, understanding the limits of recovery, and appreciating the courage necessary to continue despite the known risks. It is a testament to endurance, to sacrifice, and to the complex interplay between culture, ambition, and consequence. It is a story that must be told with care, respect, and clarity. It reminds us that greatness is inseparable from cost, that courage is inseparable from vulnerability, and that the human experience of extreme sport is as profound as it is costly. It is a story that challenges, inspires, and demands reflection on the true price of performance.